Chapter 371, Assailing Skuldarfen. General POV. The remnants of the living dragon cult who were granted passage to Skuldarfen felt the shift in the air as acutely as their long-undead brethren, the surge of power coming from the south and roars in the skies being their only warning before arrows began showering every open inch of their defenses, and the shouts of the dragons above began destroying everything around them without care for their surroundings. Narkreen watched helplessly as a full 3 of his master's loyal brothers were slaughtered in moments by the ambush, the traitors assailing the great temple, flying away without even bothering to gloat about their victory, as was usually a dragon's wont. Gnashing his rotten teeth, the dragon priest pointed his staff at the shimmering portal to the afterlife and pulled, summoning forth power from as close to Aetherius as he possibly could to protect the temple from simply getting annihilated from afar by the defiant living. Even as he cast the spell and powered the ward, he could feel his most powerful enemies ascend into the skies and begin launching their own magic, momentarily ignoring the Dover for the sake of destroying his position before he could do something. Unfortunately for the rebels, Narkreen was an ancient and skilled hand at his work, and the ward went up within moments, shielding him from a massive storm of the elements which would have descended upon him but a second later. The dragon priest worried not about stealing power that was rightfully his master's to survive. Should he live, he will have slain his lord's enemies and thus earned absolution. Death was the only alternative. Setting such thoughts aside, he rose his staff and began striking at the flying magi, content to keep him away from the loyal Dovar, who were more than numerous to win out against the traitors, he reasoned. His spells ignored the ward as if it were not even there, and he admitted a good bit of cruel amusement as he beheld an enemy mage flying upon a bird of fire scowl in annoyance, before promptly teleporting away and focusing on enemies he could actually harm. Irritating, controlling his expression was rather simple for the undead, and accepting that his foes held their own foolish form of wisdom, he began preparing for the eventuality of defeat, retreating his elite servants within the temple and crafting a battle which would whittle down the enemy numbers. Tullius's POV, settling into my suspiciously well pre-prepared perch atop the magic-made battlements Raven had me directed to, I began observing the battlefield with as much focus as I could muster. The shower of arrows seemingly coming from nowhere greatly blunted the initial enemy counterattack, allowing our forces to push up the incline between our point of entry and the temple complex itself, only to be halted at the edge itself by a well-prepared wall of shields waiting to meet them. The smaller buildings surrounding the enemy formations also served to give them some cover from the arrow rain, but nowhere near enough to stop any damage from going through, especially with the ballistae and homunculi taking their positions and shooting massive bolts into the mass of the undead whenever they were not used to harry the dragons, trying to avoid our magi and the dragons allied to us. 3 natural choke points seemed to emerge after a brief clash, slowly beginning to bog down our comparatively small force and even beginning to inflict casualties amongst the less skilled and powerful. It was a good thing I had been assigned a helper for situations such as these. "Get me Gestor," I order clearly, and one of my lesser officers rushes off to follow it. "No need, General." The Lich appears in front of me without so much as a sound, my eyes immediately twitching as I could feel his ever-mocking skeletal grin, even if I could not actually see it. "What is it that you require?" "See that position?" I point at a place where the fighting was particularly difficult, and a force of Dagoth and Redoran troops, accompanied by Zarok's best sentry, were trying to break through a shield wall of undead. "I need you to help our forces push through it. Our marksmen can barely target it, and it would let us flank the other choke points with ease." The forces accompanying King Torrig and the companions would break through the moment the enemy was attacked from behind. I could only hope the enemy did not prepare another massive ritual like they did in Windhelm. Bloody cowards. My eyes found a floating Argonian, and he seemed calm enough, which did a lot to ease my worries, even if all I had to go on was reputation and hearsay. The Lich considers my words briefly and nods, "Very well." He disappears just as swiftly as he appeared. Not even a minute later, the enemy undead begin attacking each other, allowing our people to push through and fall upon the enemy's back. A flash of light makes me blink, and a draconic roar of pain almost distracts me from my duties, but I do not permit myself to falter. Let the Magi and Heiress deal with the dragons. I had a battle to win. Durek's POV. My muscles bulge, and the chunk of rock leaves my grip, slamming into the enemy mage, who had by some miracle managed to dodge my spear throw. Great throw, shield brother. Farkas cheers, having just forced a potion down his twin's throat and saved him from being slain by the coward mage. A pair of arrows slay another mage who had almost managed to use our distraction to punish us. Both Isla and our newest recruit Hilda give us unamused stares. Gush at each other later, butcher the enemy now. The experienced huntsman growls and knocks a new arrow. Before we can offer any response, the earth shakes with the force of multiple shouts, and I see Raven fly by a heavily bleeding orange dragon, withdrawing some kind of dagger from a massive gaping wound in the creature. As if that was not enough, he is followed by his own worm, but a moment later, and the massive black beast wastes no time in completing Raven's work and clawing the smaller dragon's head off, the previously intimidating simply flopping onto the ground before its soul burst from its body and went to somewhere my eyes could not follow. A pained grunt and a grumble draws my attention back down. Did we win? I hear Vilkas asks with a disoriented grin. Not yet, brother. Farkas snorts and pulls his twin up, picking up Wuthrad with his free hand. Enough laying about now, the others are getting ahead of us. I did have to suppress a wince at the memory of that particular adventure. Against Raven's advice, we still set out for Ysgramor's tomb and set Kodlak's soul free, the Dragonborn generously directing old Esbern to help us in the quest, even if her reasoning was rather callous. If he wishes to be destroyed, who am I to stop him? She asked, and that was that. I am drawn from my memories as Vilkas immediately loses all of his drowsiness and unsheathes his sword. We can't have that now. He huffs and starts running after the closest sounds of fighting. Think we should unleash the beast? Farkas whispers, his voice barely audible to even my hearing. Not yet, I grunt. Best save it for when it is truly needed. People are dying when we could be doing more, he almost pleads. But I remain unconvinced, being an orc taught one when to keep things to himself, especially when that thing would draw even more prejudice. Instead, I grinned a toothy grin at him. They are dying gloriously, I correct him, earning a grim nod. Come, let us join them. By the time I had retrieved my spear and reached the next battle, 5 more dragons were butchered. The scene of the definitely not a vampire lady slashing one's leg off while the dragonborn caved in his chest, almost driving my inner beast out of control. Maybe it wouldn't be too bad to let loose just a little. A traitorous part of me whispers, and I feel my limbs tense and elongate slightly, just barely managing to stop the transformation as I slammed the blunt side of my spear atop a cultist's shield, smashing his head and turning it to pulp as his hand recoiled. Torrig's POV. Sovengard. Harold's battle cry sends the cultists reeling as we push up the ancient stone stairs, his dual axes cleaving through both the living and the dead. What it also cleaved through was our damned formation. Not that I could ask him to slow down, lest I ruin his berserk state. Skirnir. I call out the Stormcloak Thane, don't let him get flanked. On it, my king. The man rushes after my Thane and slams his shield into a spear-wielding Draugr, sending it flying off the platform before moving in to cut down any other would-be ambushers. I feel a slight burn on my cheek and am suddenly jerked back by Helm, the gruff commoner turned noble, getting his arm burned off as he took a flaming axe meant for my head. He did not produce a single noise as he was dragged away himself. As I sink my Skyforge blade into the offending undead's neck, a small unit of them manages to break through Harold's wall of steel, many of them pushing their shields against my force of noble warriors, while a quintet wielding 2-handed weapons made a beeline straight towards me. Thane Thorfinn of Winterhold appeared to my side then and covered them in fire to middling effect, only managing to slow them down a bit, but enough for me to react. Cursing internally, I fiddled with my belt and managed to pull out a scroll, blasting them with sunlight and pushing 3 back while ending 2. One of them mimed breathing in and began to shout, "Phoo!" but was interrupted by Thorfinn lunging at him and piercing him through his head. Sadly, that earned the young Thane a wide greatsword slash to the chest, grievously injuring him and sending him tumbling down the stairs and under the stampede of feet trying to climb up. Though he was thankfully picked up and pulled aside by Davos, who immediately injected him with a potion. Getting my head back into the fight, I charged the remaining Droga, cutting them down and moving in to help a bleeding Harold before the entirety of the enemy line just disappeared under a wave of fire, the form of Savos Aren passing us by atop his fiery mount. Couldn't have done that earlier, Davos mutters with some annoyance, absently replacing the odd barrel below his crossbow. As if to answer his question, the Archmage's mount was suddenly cut apart with a beam of lightning, and had he not teleported immediately, I held no doubts the elf would have been shorn apart for his momentary misstep. Of course. The crossbow-wielding Dunmer sighs and begins walking forward, each of his steps followed by a thunk of a bolt being fired, followed by the noise of a string pulling itself back, the distant undead reinforcements falling by the dozens as fiery explosions consumed them. Raven's POV. The constant barrage of spell, arrow and shout barely slows me down as I weave through the storm without a singular pause. The portal-powered ward atop the temple, the only thing stopping me from outright destroying all of the cult's defenses. I was a patient Mer, though, so instead of wasting my time trying to break through the obvious bait, I focused all of my counterattacks on those I could reach, and each time I dodged just enough attacks to buy myself a moment, I'd drop a firestorm atop one of their archer platforms, sent Scorch and the Shades where I could not reach swiftly enough, and Akula Khan was somewhere in the battle, keeping an eye on those I did not quite trust not to fuck up, or potentially even betray us in a crucial moment. As I dodged yet another barrage of suspiciously brand-new crossbow bolts, I turned away from my attackers on a whim and directed Magnus's staff towards an enemy dragon who was just about to grab onto Odaviing's throat with his jaws. Said jaws practically disappeared as the purple wave of immensely destructive magicka reached him, the grievous injury more than enough to distract him for Oda to shift around and claw his throat out with a victorious roar. Having done my due diligence, I teleported upwards, removing myself from the sight of my assailants and buying a split second to detect the crossbow-wielding ambushers. Not a moment later I found them, in one of the corners of the complex atop a freshly repaired flat-top tower, a group of what looked to be ex-Stormcloaks with what looked to be Legion crossbows. I almost pitied them as they burned under my ensuing firestorm, almost. The slight flash of light to my right drew my eyes, and I noticed Shalazar dodging out of the way of a purple-black dragon with odd fin-like protrusions on his back in place of spikes. The tiny lizard wizard blasted the time spirit with an impressive wave of telekinesis, sending him sprawling away and hurtling through the air, just above where I was currently hovering. Apparently not satisfied with just this, Shalazar teleported above him and sent forth another wave of telekinetic might, enough to rival a full unrelenting force if the cracked building below him was any indication, and launching him directly at my position just as I dodged another beam of lightning from the dragon priest. Taking the obvious ploy at face value, I unsummoned Magnus's staff and called forth the mortal's razor in its place, maneuvering myself to the side and aiming the blade for the dragon's chest as it went to blur past me. A perfectly timed Wuldnar Kest saw me smashing into his side for the rather impressive duration of a millisecond before his chest burst like a balloon and had me appear on the other side of the battlefield in a blur of red, both of blood and of destruction. Finding that I was now hovering just above the entrance to the temple proper, I couldn't help but chuckle at just how perfectly Shalazar could orchestrate things even in the midst of battle. I landed before the grand gates of the temple, a small army of some respectably powerful Draugr glaring at me as I summoned blasphemy and flicked its new shaft into existence. The undead flinched back on sheer instinct as the blade made itself known, but they just as quickly formed a shield wall to forestall me. Tilting my head to the side with a satisfying pop, I began twirling my sword spear around, giving a quick look at the forces of my allies. I smirked and turned back to the Draugr. It has been a bit since I've had some proper exercise, and I obviously had time to kill. I wasn't stupid enough to rush ahead on my own, no matter how powerful. The Draugr make the first move as one of the more ornately armored ones attempts to blast me apart with a wave of unrelenting force. With a downright unnatural grace, guided by both my base speed and a surge of magic, I danced away from the impact, appearing to the side of the leftmost group and slashing out at them while casting dragon flesh on myself in the same movement. Mehrunes' blessing made the spell ridiculously simple to cast. The entire side of the shield wall was either disintegrated by Blasphemy's undead slaying enchantment or sent flying with the sheer force of my strike, disorienting them for but the briefest of moments and allowing me to sink even deeper into their mass. With each step, my attacks became faster and less forceful as I weaved through their comparatively childish attempts at taking me down, my weapon shifting from sword spear to sword and back constantly. Each slash turned a foe to ash, and each stab combined with the sudden elongating of my weapon sent those trying to gang up on me reeling, and where even that failed to affect them, a cloak of sunfire delayed them long enough for me to react, if not outright killing them. Soon their numbers began to dwindle, and I had to wait more and more between every kill, bringing my little killing spree to its inevitable conclusion. Sensing friendly reinforcements approaching, I decided to end it with a blast of sunlight and rose my hand to caw. My instincts flare, and a blink later the shout of Zunhalfike manages to glance me before I am able to dodge fully, the Draga who used it already moving in with a heavy swing of his hammer as my sword spear dematerialized on its own. Without waiting for even a moment, I blasted the row of rushing undead before me with a wave of scorching sunlight and rounded on my attacker. Taking a swift step into his attack and thus away from his striking zone, I grabbed him by the sides of his head. A torrent of magic flowed into my arms, and with a loud crunch, the Draga champion's head burst into so much bone meal as I closed my hands in a mime of a mocking clap. Blasphemy flickered back into my hand within a blink after that. Perfectly timed to allow a lazy swing of my hand to suddenly decapitate yet another mummy-looking twat who tried sneaking up on me while I was distracted. My short, enthusiastic walk ended after that, though, as the companions, the blades, some of the Redoran, and all 5 of my paladins finally caught up, flanking the heavily distracted Draugr and cutting them down with impressive speed. Anandor goes to say something, but is interrupted by the bronze form of a dragon suddenly skidding between us as Minthara rammed her hammer into the poor fucker's spine and utterly shattered it, somehow directing it exactly to the summit and managing a perfect landing. She did not even look at the gurgling Dover as she swung out once again and broke his cranium one-handed, not even so much as twitching as the fresh soul slammed into her. Letting out an appreciative whistle at the sight, I grinned at Minthara. Remember when these used to be an actual threat? Her eyes lock onto mine and she smiles, a proud and arrogant thing, but not undeserved, good times. She nods and begins walking up to the closed gates barring our path. Before she can try and blow the whole damn thing up, I raise a hand to forestall her wards. She slowly exhales and glares at the gates, as if that would make them move. Of course. Instead of being bothered by the fact that the gate was freshly enchanted with some rather potent anti-magic and anti-Thume wards, obviously meant to exhaust and delay us, I came up with a solution one might even dare call elegant. Tolfdir, I call out to the youthful old man who had joined us in the meantime, as did more and more of our allies. Would you do our hosts the honor of knocking? Politely, of course, I add with a smirk. Hopefully this wouldn't end as it did in Volkihar. Having to shout this one apart would be far, far more annoying. A fierce grin spreads on his face, revealing a nasty row of tusks, bloody with dragon bits. It would be my pleasure. He growls and approaches the gate. I feel a surge of magicka almost as vast as my own shake the air around us as his form becomes more than it was a moment ago. And then he grabs onto the small space between the 2 wings of the gate, claws his way through the enchanted metal with barely any resistance, and with a grunt of exertion shoves the gates open, destroying the left wing in the process and sending the right sprawling down the nearby edge. Rubbing his hands in satisfaction, Tolfdir turns to us, looking just a bit smug. Dear me, I appear to have forgotten my manners. I huff out in amusement and start walking. I am sure our venerable hosts will forgive us in time. Yes, he grins. Let us go and greet them. I wouldn't mind giving them my explanation in person. The stupor of the gathering crowd breaks, and as if there was no pause at all, the surge of armored bodies follows behind us like a flood. Well, at least they did for a brief moment, before a veritable torrent of Draugr burst from every crevice, all of them wearing enchanted armor and feeling quite a bit more potent than their brethren outside. A massive unit of a Draugr, clad in full ebony plate and a grand winged helmet, steps in front of them and points his chill-encrusted greatsword at me, growling out a challenge in broken Dovazul. A part of me was a tad annoyed at the delay, but the way the little shit was glaring at me was enough to make crushing him worth the while, even if it was an obvious ploy to ambush us. A part of me reasoned. Not that I particularly cared, all of them would die, one way or another. Chapter 372, The Temple Summit. Even as I prepared to charge my opponent, I still felt the wards of this place pressing down on all of us, trying to stifle our magic utterly, and while I myself was more than capable of pushing through it with contemptuous ease, the rest would suffer greatly before the battle was done. That needed to be dealt with quickly. Shalazar, Tolfdir, ward now! I yell out without looking away from the Draugr overlord, feeling the duo I called out still briefly before nodding at each other and pulling back behind the lines and getting to work. Nodding in satisfaction, I allowed myself a smirk, and then promptly teleported behind the undead. With some difficulty, I noted as a spatial lock attempted to assert itself, slashing for his neck fast enough to make the air whistle. Fucker blocked me without even looking at me, even had the temerity to do the slow turnaround and grin at me through his helmet. I naturally rewarded him with a full-face blast of sunfire. He was no longer as amused and attempted to freeze me solid with a swift growl, "Is slen nus." Fame Z. Immediately responding by turning myself ethereal, I passed through the Overlord, sealing the fate of the few Draugr who were attempting to flank me moments earlier and shattering them with a twitch of telekinesis a moment later. My hand was already moving into an overhead slash as I rematerialized, only for me to suddenly twitch to the side as a beam of deep purple lightning destroyed the wall where I was standing a moment earlier. The dragon priest had made his move. Narkreen, if memory served, was supposed to be some kind of leader figure in the cult, and it showed his robes were far more ornate than those of his comrades, and most impressively, they were still fully intact, the staff in his hand brimming with the unfamiliar but easily identifiable power of Sovengard. As I observed him, I let out a derisive snort, not visibly angering him, even as his magicka surged even further than before. I did not ponder the no-doubt arrogant string thoughts he had, as he looked at me and turned back to my enemy in time to fling away his heavy slash accompanied by a roar and a growl, just as Minthara burst from within the messy fighting happening all around us and aimed to slam her hammer into the priest's head. He would never make it that easy, though, as he followed my example by turning himself ethereal and retreating behind his goons. Not that they themselves lasted for more than a second, as a rather annoyed Dragonborn simply walked through them with a whirlwind sprint and was already back in the priest's face. The battle around us was far less one-sided, however, as more than a dozen of our companions had fallen to the elite Draugr, their shouts being too much for the mostly melee fighter-composed force. Not willing to just let the undead go to town, though, I abused the fact that my opponent could only attack me so many times in a second, and began showering the entire battle with wide-range solar magic. My magicka churned so much that my fingers ached as they drew power from my rings, but the sudden lack of pressure on my allies was more than worth the light annoyance, as they soon began pushing the undead back, the ancient embalmed warriors now notably slower and less reactive than before. The Draugr before me had no such issues, however, his armor enchanted to resist and absorb as much magicka as possible. I was honestly surprised that he had not yet exploded from the sheer volume of the power I was letting out. Then again, the constantly charging ebony flesh he was casting with surprising efficiency swiftly disabused me of the notion he was just slurping my magicka like so much mead. Unlike his friends, his attacks became faster and faster as each moment passed, soon pushing me back enough that I decided that was enough of fair play and promptly summoned some professional aid. Without any warning, Akulakan barreled through a group of Draugr with a single swing of the blunt end of his glaive, sending bone flying everywhere as he rammed the Draugr overlord with more force than a charging cavalryman. giving me the perfect opening to stab my sword through his visor and suddenly extend it by summoning its staff shaft. Fucker was still growling at me from his new perch in the wall before I simply decided, fuck it, and stabbed him with the razor, shattering his entire torso and a good chunk of his armor. A shame for a masterwork to be destroyed so blatantly, but needs must and all that. The fight ended quickly after that. Narkreen, seeing where the winds were blowing, retreated back to no doubt prepare another welcome, and his thralls, now alone and unsupported, were methodically cut down in detail, all of our allies falling upon the nearest enemy the moment they won their respective fights. The last Draga fell when the ebony warrior slammed its head with his shield as he was just about to skewer Isla the Huntress in the side, the entire chamber descending into an uneasy quiet as he did. Casualties? I fired the question off, my crown receding for the moment and snapping out the lot of them from their newfound stupor. Potions were immediately handed out and people got to work saving as many as possible. While they did so, I approached Davos. Think you can scout forward and see what awaits? Sure thing, boss. He nods, a bit uneasy. Think you can send someone to watch my back, though? Even I can feel the wards in this place. Before I can answer, the glamoured-up form of Phineas floats up behind him, and he places his distinctly bony-feeling hand on the short Dunmer's shoulder, causing him to yelp in surprise. I will go with him. Worst-case scenario, I stay to hold back any attempt at an ambush while he retreats. Most gracious of you, I offer the Lich a mocking bow and Davos a smirk before leaving them to their work and turning to Orin, who had just run up to me with a casualty report. And going by his expression, this was going to be a long-ass slog. Minthara's POV. By the time we finally reached fresh air again, I was practically vibrating in anger. So annoyed was I that I did not even notice how my fury was enough to keep my dragon aspect up for long after it was supposed to expire. 4 God's damned ambushes, each more harrowing than the last. 4 ambushes, and some 4 dozen people who chose to follow me dead, and most of them being people who had grown on me in the past weeks of hunting dragons and earning glory. Raven himself was downright furious. The oldest of his 3 captain brothers was disintegrated by a life-drain shout. One of his paladins had his neck snapped with a hammer, and worst of all, Davos nearly got killed on 3 separate occasions, the dragon priest seemingly targeting him in particular without rhyme or reason. Or maybe it had something to do with the quite frankly ridiculous casualties he was inflicting with his crossbow. Who knows? He was so annoyed that I could feel his power straining against the wards, the very walls shuddering, that the weight of his presence as he was forced to improvise his sudden lack of foresight with what he called a poor man's radar. Whatever those words meant, and I would make him tell me later, it seemed to work as after the first close shave with death. His right-hand elf had we were not taken by surprise again, even if more and more people died with each battle. Potions were powerful, but they could do nothing against mental fatigue, and a lack of reaction speed here was as deadly as enemy blades. Speaking of blades, my own blades made a good showing of themselves. Esbern was quite stifled by the wards, but Delphine was cutting through Draga with such speed, I got the impression she was trying to make some kind of point. She was, but it was still funny to think about. My spectres and Raven's shades started picking up more of the fighting as we went deeper in, and while they were not able to hold the line as well as the rest of us, they were still useful for delaying the enemy by using them as distractions. The final Draga blocking our path crumpled to dust under my hammer. The ancient servant of the dragons was strong, but not strong enough to resist a combined effort from the strongest among those still living. The equipment would have made for good loot, but apparently we needed to keep up morale and reward our allies. Raven gave me an amused glance, as if reading my thoughts, before the 2 of us rushed up the staircase, fully expecting to be faced with a throng of Dremora or anything the dragon priest could still summon to delay us from our inevitable victory. The priest met us silently, levitating in place and looking far worse for wear than when we first faced him. His robes were ripped and damaged, and his mask cracked in multiple spots, all of them from moments he barely managed to get out of my reach before I could crack his skull with one well-placed swing. "Forgive me, my master," I heard the priest mutter with a bow of his head, grasping his ornate dragon-beaked staff with both hands. He rose it up above his head, and the portal below him, which had been lightly bubbling with power, suddenly burst upwards, the power immediately flowing into the priest as he glared at us. For a moment I feared the portal would be destroyed, but save for a bit of shuddering and creaking of stone, the dam that held back the flowing power of Sovengard managed to hold. The priest rose his staff again, and the air shook, the wards suddenly pressing down on us with even greater power as I felt more than heard some of our weaker followers fall onto their knees as their breath became heavy. Heretics and blasphemers. The priest rasped as he glared at us, and me specifically, foolish usurpers. Power surged from within him, visibly cracking his skin and robes and almost completely ruining his mass. Come and meet your end. Raven's POV. Watching the people behind me, panic almost managed to make me break my composure and let out an amused chuckle, though I was distracted quickly enough by the downright impressively crafted magic circle now floating above us. My amusement was promptly destroyed then as I identified the spell he was trying to cast. A meteor shower would slaughter most of the people following us, and that was just unacceptable to me. I did not just slog through a temple filled to the brim with unfairly powerful undead just so they could all get one shot by a cheeky mage. That was my job, not his. It was with almost sadistic glee that I spoke then. Tolfida, do it. My soft voice ringing out loudly and more importantly widely enough for me to be heard even at the bottom of the mountain. Obviously the dragon priest heard me as well, his channeling becoming even more frantic and self-destructive in an attempt to preempt whatever it was that I had suddenly cooked up. But it was already far, far too late. Tolfdir, Shalazar, and a force under the leadership of the Ebony Warrior had descended into the depths of the temple, clearing out the admittedly well-hidden ward scheme. The ward shuddered and then cracked. The priest panicked, but he could do nothing as the power he had absorbed and relied on the entire complex to control swiftly destabilized and began wreaking havoc within and without his body. We were saved from the sudden storm of spatial slashes and bursts of raw power by Akalakan, who followed his purpose perfectly and cast a defensive ward potent enough to block it out, or in the worst cases, slow the storm enough for me to block it myself. Narkreen himself, though, was far less fortunate. His form bulged, twisted, and crackled with power before he was simply overloaded and detonated into brilliant multicolored light. The remnants of his soul a minuscule shard, barely enough to power a rat. Before we could relax, the spell which was still in the skies began summoning the meteor shower, powerful enough to outright kill most of the people who had followed us, and more worryingly, destroy the entirety of the temple. Thankfully, we were not the only ones paying attention to this, as a trio of voices ringing out across the field saved us from the imminent divine levels of an enemy getting the last laugh. Odaviing, Krenarvoken and Vulstran Fane all shouted, "Lok var kur!" As one, the shout thankfully counting to dispel the storm the priest had summoned. Things turned completely silent then, the warriors behind us feeling lost by the sudden end to the fighting, only for the soft ting of a piece of mask hitting the ground to break them from their stupor, the roar of victory soon following the tiniest and yet heaviest of sounds. General POV. As the victorious cheers finally died down, the group of nobles and leaders led by High King Torrig approached Minthara and Raven, both of whom were staring at the still bubbling portal with an unusual intensity. "That is the path to Sovengard?" Jarl Balgruf asked aloud. "Yep." The young Dunmer Archmage smacked his lips, straight into the afterlife. "I guess kids will do anything for a thrill these days," Savos Aren quips. "Quite." The suspiciously still pristine form of Phineas Gestor nodded. "I have no idea what kind of effect entering the bloody thing would have, but I am not about to check." "You can't enter anyway." Raven turned around with a shrug, Minthara still too busy staring at the swirling blues and purples. "Only those of a certain blood may survive such a thing." "Our duties are done then?" The leader of the Redoran contingent spoke up. "It all falls to a single person then." "Your part in this is done, yes." Lord Dagoth gave him a light but grateful nod. "Good." The Dunmer warrior offered a crisp salute and left to tend to his men. Awfully serious, that one. Thane Harold scoffs, though his eyes are quite telling of his respect for the elf. "You sure the lot of us can't go and help her?" "Her?" Raven raises an amused eyebrow. What makes you think I am not going? Raven, Torrig sighs. You just all but told us one needed to be of divine descent to enter the portal. How He pauses. Oh no. Oh yes. Raven's red eyes glow with glee. You will find, High King, that I am something of a godling myself. The sound of Davos's palm hitting his face could be heard across the entire summit. The king's shoulders slumped. You know I want to say I am surprised, but at this point this is just par for the course. He sighs, even as General Tullius stares at Raven so intently he could burn a hole through his skull. Giving the mildly disturbed general a quick wink, the young Dunmer turned back to Torrig and smirked. You know you love me, and turned to leave. Raven's POV. As I joined Minthara and lightly tugged at her shoulder to shake her from her stupor, the people behind us turned utterly silent. Well then, I muttered quietly, off we go to the afterlife. The hesitant demigoddess lets out a whine of distress, but still follows after me. The quiet behind us is broken by someone slamming a sword on their shield, my sight quickly informing me that it was Torrig. A moment later he did it again, now joined by another dozen of those still standing, and then another and another, until everyone was either stomping or slamming their weapons or making some kind of noise, and the summit of Skuldafn nearly shook. Both my steps and Minthara's became more sure then, even as the crowd began chanting a mix of Dagoth and Dragonbane, soon joined by the distant roar of the three dragons, wishing us a good battle. As we neared it, Minthara did not stop and simply passed through the portal, unwilling to give herself any more time to hesitate. I, on the other hand, turned to the slowly quietening crowd and offered them a deep bow before straightening and allowing myself to fall into the portal back first. Chapter 373. In the Mists of Sovengard. Oof, I groan as my back hits the dirt, more for dramatics than any actual pain. Minthara looks at me for a moment with a genuinely dumbfounded expression before letting out a snort. Dumbass. She mutters and offers me a hand. I wince as I feel a rock which had perfectly wedged itself in the space between my crown and my armor, though the pain disappears instantly as I grasp the offered hand, swiftly settling on my feet and needlessly dusting off my robes. Dramatics are a perfect reason for unreasonable behavior. I nod to myself. She just shakes her head with a smile and begins looking around us, something I follow a moment later. The first thing I noticed is that there was no portal behind us, only a circular rock formation standing where the passage should have been. My eyes narrowed with suspicion, but there was nothing I could do for the moment, so I turned to observe the rest of the Nord's warrior afterlife. Most of it was covered in a thick and indubitably supernaturally heavy mist, my sight barely managing to pierce it even when I focused on any specific location. There were still areas free of it, though, and I could see vast hills and mountains jutting from the sea of white, all of them covered in deep green grasses and trees. The skies, on the other hand, were free of any mist, and a beautiful permanent aurora borealis shimmered in a dance of color so delightfully pretty I could stare at it for a day and not get tired of it. Though the thing that drew most of my attention was not the things I could see, but those I could feel. The magicka was far purer than that of Nirn. The power feeling so abundant and untainted, I felt I could draw it into me without even the slightest difficulty. Not that I did that. Who knew what would happen to me if I overdosed on afterlife juice? There was also some kind of pressure, attempting to worm its way into my very soul, but seemingly being unable to grasp it. My shroud and my nature as someone who defies the divine, by his very blood holding back the likely attempt of integrating me. The mist, Minthara's voice draws me from my observation, looking like she could feel none of the dangers I could. It feels dangerous. Likely something Alduin did, I guess, makes it easier to hunt down lost souls. Bastard, she hisses. At least he could look the innocent dead in the eye before he desecrates them. I give her a blank look. Yeah. She waves me away. We've already established that he is a cunt. Letting out a light snort, I begin walking down the rocky path leading into the mist. We could spend a year coming up with valid reasons to murder the fucker, a year we don't have. I wave for her to follow after me. Come on, best we get done with this. She follows with a huff. You are way too relaxed about this, she mutters. Oh, trust me, I am scared shitless, I admit with a wry chuckle. The lack of portal behind us no doubt means that there is no escape from here, and even if I do not fear death, facing soul death is another thing entirely. Idly, I pick up a random rock of the ground, inspecting it closely. I channel a bit of magicka through in a specific pattern, and the stone dissipates completely, turning perfectly into the magic of this place. Damn, I whistle. The magic here is way too malleable. It isn't like there are living magi to fuck with it. Minthara gives me a sidelong glance. Well, most of the time. Part of me wants to see if I could cook something up. I sigh, but I don't think we have a few days to just fuck around and build traps. No, she mutters, we do not. Let us away then. I raise a finger dramatically, onwards into the totally not murderous mists. The closer we got to the mist, the heavier it felt, my sight still barely managing to pierce the edges of it, but turning utterly useless as I tried looking deeper. Still feeling like experimenting, I channeled a bit of my divinity and felt my gaze get shoved through, revealing a vague outline of the area around me and the faintest of silhouettes of souls in front of us. Definitely Alduin then, I speak up. The mist is divine in nature. So no magically removing it. Minthara sighs, guess we will have to slog through it then. I turn to her with an annoyed look, and she fails to hide a smirk. Yell at the mist now, please. Fi ini, she surrenders and speaks instead of shouts, Lokva kor, dissipating a good 50-meter circle all around us and revealing the way forward. Both of us stop then, as we are met with a rather odd sight. I find it rather difficult to describe it otherwise, admittedly, as we were met with a group of freshly slain Nords. Familiar Nords, in fact. The 15 or so Nord souls immediately turned to us, a few of them giving me odd looks specifically, while one of them stepped out of the group. You haven't fallen, have you? He asks. No. Minthara shakes her head, a sad look in her eyes. We made it to the portal. Good. The once young man nods. Good, our deaths were not in vain there. He turns to me and I recognize him as a kid from Rorikstead who had joined the Dragon Hunters recently, Eric or something. How are you here? He asks me. I shrug and smirk at him smugly, as if I'd ever miss out on ending this. I can't begrudge you that, Flame Tongue. He chuckles and looks back to Minthara. We would join your quest, dead as we are, Dragonborn. She hesitates, but then nods. I would be honored. We continued on the path then, the procession turning solemn as a few more dead. Those who died earlier in the battle joined us one by one, bringing our numbers up to a nice even 30 by the time we reached our next stop. And when we did, I felt my eye twitching with a mix of surprise and annoyance. Codlac Whitemane sat atop a rock, talking animatedly with Ulfric fucking Stormcloak, Galmar Stonefist, and to my greatest surprise, Archmage Guldur himself. What are you doing here? I ask before my brain can fully process the sight. Guldur, the one I directed my gaze at, immediately met it with his own, young enchanter. He greets me with a smile while the other two wait patiently, Ulfric and his right-hand man remaining surprisingly calm and silent. I see you have finally made your way to this sacred place. Didn't we agree you would wait for a year or two before leaving for the afterlife? I ask him. What made you think that coming here now was a good idea? You will find, child, he smirks at me, that even if I am a mage, I yet remain a Nord, and no sane Nord would avoid the battle at the end of the world. Here, here. Codlac Whitemane raises a hand, now holding a pint of mead, which materialized itself as if on demand. The old companion takes a long sip and gives me a slow nod. I have heard from my students of the advice you gave them. Your intentions honor you, young one, but you will find that rare is the warrior worthy of Sovengard who would miss a chance such as this. That is your choice, I offer him a shrug. I simply made my own. As you should. He nods, bows his head to Minthara and goes back to his drink. And then finally my gaze meets Ulfric's. We both stare at each other for a while, my disdain filling the air to face his simple determination. Dagoth. He is the first to speak. Stormcloak. My lips thin, think you can redeem yourself by dying twice over. He closes his eyes and shakes his head. My redemption matters not in the slightest. I have lived a flawed life and have made flawed decisions. This shall not be one of them. How convenient. I huff, but still feel like adding, your kid survived, by the way. He shall reach heights I never would. Stormcloak bows his head. Galmar just gives me a gruff nod. It was a good fight. That it was. I smile and step back, and Minthara takes my spot at the front. All four of them immediately incline their heads in a bow, dragonborn. They intone, our might is yours, directed. Completely unbothered by the obvious risks, or simply understanding the Nord mindset more than myself, she gives them a solemn nod. Follow us then, the battle is not far off now. They form up and join our procession, the solemnity and silence of it returning for a while as we went deeper and deeper into the Nordic afterlife. Minthara walking at the head of our troop and following some kind of call as she kept to one direction even through the mists. I felt Golda step beside me before I saw him, the ancient archmage looking ironically more lively than he did when I first met him. I see you have made use of my teachings. He comments after a silent moment, and surpassed them. Jealous? I ask with a smirk. The old man chuckles, a happy smile on his face. Far from it, apprentice. It brings me great joy that our art is capable of reaching such heights. You honor me. I bow my head slightly. I could not have reached such skill without your help. Immediately he scoffs. Couldn't have reached it, my rotten arse. He curses. It would have just taken you more time. That I was able to get some of the glory by teaching you a bit is just my good fortune. I turn to him and give him a blank look. You know, the humility would have been endearing, if you actually deigned to at least pretend to sound humble. He chuckles merrily at that. Ruin my scheme, why don't you? And what is this scheme? I raise an eyebrow. 'Tis simple, really. He shrugs. I want you to at least try and stop me from getting devoured. A snort leaves me unbidden. No, say Nord, my grey bloody ass cheeks. The old man huffs and shakes his head. Will you help me or not? Fine, you scheming old fart. I shake my head with amusement. Just don't expect me to die for you. I am old, not stupid, he points out dryly and lets me move on without him. Is it true then? I hear Ulfric's voice slightly to my right, him and Galmar staring at Minthara with a mix of awe and regret. You truly are descended from Martin Septim. Minthara pinches the bridge of her nose with some annoyance and nods. Yes. Then we were even more wrong than I thought at first. Ulfric sighs, his once right hand gripping his shoulder supportively. Want to hear something utterly hilarious, Ulfric? I speak up as I near the group, and the two dead men immediately look at me warily, while Minthara just rolls her eyes and gives me an amused look. Ulfric sighs. What is it, Dagoth? Mead legalized Talos worship like a month ago, I tell him with a shit-eating grin. The Thalmor got pushed back by the Red Guards, and he used the opportunity to tell their ambassador to go fuck herself. Both of the once rebels miss a step, Galmar outright stumbling for a second before he managed to catch himself, the pained hiss of fuck leaving the bare of a man's lips unbidden. Ulfric, on the other hand, merely shook his head. Go on then, court mage, he tells me, mock me for my failures and my foolishness. I am used to it by now. Oh, you don't get to compare me to the Thalmor, you ass, I growl at him, the nasty mood lasting for but a split second. You are the one who led to the deaths of thousands of his own people. You don't get to pull the pity card now. It is as you say, he inclines his head. You have all the right to gloat. I let out an annoyed huff. Fucking ruin my fun, why don't you? Minthara just starts giggling then and there, eliciting the slightest upward twitch of Ulfric's lips. I just let out a derisive snort and speed up. None bother me until we reach our destination. Finally, the mists gave way without prompting, and our small troop steps out into a majestic sight. A grand Nordic palace sitting atop a monolithic outcropping of stone, connected to the rest of Sovengard by a narrow and disturbingly insecure bridge made of massive whalebones. And in front of that bridge stood an absolute unit of a man, or god as I knew him to be, staring at us all intently. The moment his eyes met mine, though, his mouth fell open, and he, honest to Dagoth, gawked at me, thoroughly breaking the solemn and serious air around him, as my mouth twisted into a smug smirk. Chapter 374, Confusing Gods and Crashing Parties. Tsun gathered himself with an almost deliberate slowness, pointedly looking away from me and surveying the rest of those gathered, most of whom were now kneeling before him. In fact, all of them had taken a knee, everyone except Minthara and myself, in fact. How incredibly cut solemn. I reflexively covered my mouth to conceal a cough that never came. Though judging by the amused shine in Minthara's eyes, she shared my thoughts. Nodding to himself after having found whatever he was looking for, Tsun spoke, "I am Tsun, shield thane of Shore and guardian of the Whalebone Bridge. Be welcomed, ye brave souls, to Sovengard, Soul's End, Shore's gift to the honored dead." He nods as they lower their heads further and turns to the two of us. "And what of ye, wayfarers grim? What seek you in this place where no living shall tread?" "Shan't tread, eh?" I scoff. "But they are permitted fly, no?" He closes his eyes and offers the slightest of nods. Alduin's soul snare bears its dreadful grip upon the land, and every soul that ventures forth swiftly meets its end. By Shore's command, our blades were sheathed, and we remained within the hall, for he foresaw our doom. "You don't seem like a simple soul to me," I point out needlessly. He nods once more. "Your words ring true, traveller odd, yet my strength is below that of the World-Eater, and should I face him on my own, then the vile fiend would soon feast on those honoured dead of the Hall of Valor." "So you keep a barrier of some sort?" I quirk an eyebrow and look around. The lack of mist was rather telling indeed. "That's fair. It is no honourable deed to watch, as the worm devours the honoured dead, but my duty is to my charges," the large man admits solemnly, and then looks back up to us, his solemnity now replaced with a determined stare. "So I ask of you again, travellers grim, what brings you to these hallowed lands?" It is Minthara who answers, "We are after Alduin. It isn't only Sovengard that has suffered under him, and he has earned his slaying 1,000 times over." "A fateful errand." Tsun nods. "Have you come to bring these worthy souls out of the way for your battle?" I blink at him. Minthara, however, is far less subdued. "Out of the way." She grits her teeth. "Alduin threatens everything, and you would simply have everyone step out of the way." The large man stares at her dispassionately. "My duty is to guard the dead. It is their choice if they wish to follow you to battle." "Honored Tsun," Golder speaks up, "we know that to reach the Hall of Valor, one must offer you a challenge." The god nods. "Would our valor not be proven if we were to aid these heroes, yet living in facing the World-Eater? Speak you from great caution or mere pragmatism?" Tsun looks down at the mage, and before the old man can respond, he answers, "Should you give battle to Alduin of your own will, no greater proof of your valor will I need." The old mage fails to hide a wide smirk, and I note a hint of disdain in the god's eyes. There is far more than a hint in the eyes of Kodlak, Ulfric and Galmar, but none of them speak up. Golder had made an oopsie, it would seem. He was behaving like an arrogant cunt. Scorch chirps dryly, "No true Nord, right." Tsun once more looks to the two of us. "I cannot stop you from offering your challenge to the beast, yet by what right would you seek to enter the Hall of the Dead and petition its honoured folk for aid?" "I am Dragonborn." Minthara speaks simply. "The simple act I am standing here, without the very land trying to devour me, should tell you all you need to know of my right." The large man inclines his head. "Many a winter has it been since I have faced a doom-driven hero of the dragon blood. Your right to challenge me, I recognize." Tilting her head to the side with a loud pop, Minthara twirls her right hand, unsheathing Dovakren from a clasp on her back, and with another twist leans it on her shoulder, her left hand remaining seemingly empty but already curling into a clawed shape, something she had gotten very used to since she mastered her dragon aspect. Tsun tenses up, grips his own battle axe, and in the blink of an eye the two clash, the bridge guardian getting pushed back by the sheer force of Minthara's strike, carving a gash through the stone below him, which then quickly repaired itself. Within the same instant of her charging him, Minthara had already shouted out her dragon aspect, and as she smashed her hammer into Tsun's guard one-handed, her other hand, now covered in draconic scales and claws, lashed out for his heart, nearly tearing it out in a single swing as the god shoved her back and retreated a few steps. Smiling calmly, Minthara too stepped back and tensed for yet another clash, but it would seem her strength had been more than proven as Tsun lowered his axe. Your might. He shook his head. I have not seen its peer in many an era. That's it? The poor demigoddess grumbles, having gotten wound up for nothing. We could go on, of course. There is an amused glint in the god's eye as he offers her a truly genuine smile, but you are here for a purpose, no? Yeah, she grumbles and reclasps her hammer, stepping out of the way, sitting next to the honored dead, who had naturally already broken out the mystical mead from out of nowhere, and immediately began bombarding her with praise as she sat. His merriment gone once more, the god turns to me with a far more grim expression. And by which right do you, traveller odd, demand entry into the halls of the honored Nord dead? The word Nord rings out quite clearly, and a silence descends upon the recently merry band of warriors. I just tilt my head with a smirk and decide to reward the question with an appropriate answer. I could go on and on about how much aid I have offered Skyrim and her people. I list slowly while approaching the frowning god. I could mention my accomplishment as Archmage or my deeds in dragon slaying. I pause a short 2 meters from him. I could even go as far as to mention stopping Baal from enacting a plan to shroud the world in an eternal night and place it under the rule of his vampires. No doubt having some form of lie detection that works on a divine level, Tsun's eyes widen at that last one. But no, I still wasn't done though. I seek entry by simple right of blood. Blood, the god asks very slowly, of whose blood do you speak? Smirking so much my mouth hurt, I unleashed a bit of my aura from beneath my shroud, allowing the ancient being before me to see exactly what I was talking about. By the blood of the trickster, of course, I bow flamboyantly. The blood of Lorcan, I continue and look up with the shit-eatiest of shit-eating grins. The blood of Shaw. Tsun recoils, actually recoils as the last words leave my mouth, his grip on his axe making the mystical wood creak under the strain as his bewildered gaze refused to move from my glowing red eyes. Child of the thief, he hisses. Thief? I step back, tilting my head as I did. You could look at it that way, but I have committed no theft of my own, now have I? Regardless, he almost growls, your mere existence is an abo. His words catch in his throat when he feels something pressing on his neck. The mortal's razor poised a mere millimeter from piercing his skin and killing him on the spot. Come now, my good fellow, we wouldn't want to use such naughty words that we can't take back, would we? I pat him on the cheek a couple of times and add, trickster god, remember? He grits his teeth and says nothing. I allow myself the slightest smirk of victory and shadow step back to my previous position. Stolen or not, I am of Nirn, and thus of him. I just have a tiny bit more of him in me, no? Why would you reveal this? Tsun sighs. Your deeds are more than enough to enter the hall. Oh, that, I blink and shrug. You annoyed me. The god balks at me for the second time in a day. What? Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. I smile at him, and I trust that my near rending your being from existence is enough for my proof of valor. He wants to glare at me, but is so thoroughly thrown off by my unusual behavior that he just straightens back up and nods. You have proven your strength and valor, Hono. He pauses as he glances at me, sees my shit-eating grin and sighs. Just get into the hall now, please. Barely keeping ourselves quiet, Minthara and I nod at the disturbed god, instruct the rest of the group to wait for us, and step onto the whalebone bridge. The moment we pass the first few spines of the gargantuan bridge and step out of earshot, both of us burst into laughter, Minthara wiping tears from her eyes as she mock-glared at me. Did you really have to do that to him? He was being racist. I shrug and snort. As I said, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Wiping the last tear of laughter from her face, she straightens up and keeps walking. That was a nice distraction. Hopefully we won't offend all the heroes of old into not helping us. I just whistle innocently at that. Raven, she sighs, no insulting the first harbinger. I have no idea what you are talking about. I look away into the distant skies. Why would I of all people want to shit-talk Ysgramor until he cried? Do I look like I have that much free time on my hands? Her deadpan stare followed me all the way to the grand doorway of the hall, her utter lack of trust in my bullshit placing a physical weight on my shoulders. We both pushed one wing of the doors, sharply swinging them open and sending a slight gale through the Hall of Valor, which looked to be both paradoxically small and massive at the same time, allowing us to see everyone within at once, yet housing far, far too many ancient Nord heroes for its supposed size. Well, I mutter quietly, at least the number makes some sense. Thousands of years of near-constant conflict on at least a local scale would produce the 1,000 or so great heroes I was looking at right now. The music within the hall quietened down, and the residents stopped their revelry as they turned to look at us, their gazes ranging from welcoming to dispassionate to calculating. These were no pure heroes of the tales, but the victors of great battles and challenges, and not many among their number could be accurately called fools. A murmur passed through the heroic gathering, and soon a group of 5 stepped forward to meet us. 3 I recognized immediately, all of them armed, armored, and ready for battle, the same group who had faced Alduin entire eras ago. The other 2 I could guess at quite accurately, an old grey-bearded man in familiar robes and a tall man armored in the oldest style of armor present and armed with a mystical representation of Wuthrad, that filthy thing. Though their presence paled in comparison to the gaze that was not quite a gaze piercing, or at least attempting to pierce into my soul and see what I was, the feeling of distant kinship that only I could feel wafting in the air but doing no more than merely acknowledging my presence. I was just kind of bullshitting soon outside, but now I wasn't so certain. In the short moment of my distraction, the group of ancient heroes stopped moving, and the one I recognized as Ysgramor stepped forward. "Welcome, warriors." His voice boomed as his eyes focused on Minthara, pausing only for the briefest moments on her ears. "Dragonborn, long have we awaited your coming, our swords sheathed and our bitterness waxing even in these hallowed halls. Tell us, have you come to rid us of the scourge that plagues these lands?" "We have indeed," she speaks, and her voice carries throughout the hall, "but the worm is mighty, too mighty for us to ensure victory, and we come seeking the aid of all who would risk it all to face the end." "You would ask us to give battle, even in our state?" Jurgen Windcaller asks quietly. Not that the detail mattered, since everyone heard him perfectly. "We have earned our peace, Dragonborn. Do not be so swift to tear it away." "I tear away at nothing," she answers simply, pointedly resting her hand on Jurgen's horn hanging off her belt. "I only ask for those who value their valor more than their empty existences in these halls." The murmurs of "empty" spread throughout the hall, numerous questioning glances being directed at the perfectly calm demigoddess. "Empty indeed," I speak up, catching on to her game and swiftly earning a lot more questioning looks as people finally acknowledged my presence here. "For what is the purpose you hold, feasting and singing and fighting in these hallowed halls if not empty stagnation? Do you not wish to notch another grand victory onto your belts, to prove once and forevermore that you are indeed the true heroes of Skyrim? We have long since proven our right to be here." An outraged voice rings out from far away, yet close at the same time. "You've no right to question our eternal reward." "One deed," Minthara continues, "where I left off 2 deeds." Her gaze wanders the great hall, moments in time, passed in a blink, and yet worthy of eternity. "Have you come here to gather allies?" Ysgramor raises an annoyed eyebrow, "or to question our worthiness?" Jurgen sighed, seeing his companion fall for it. "Question your worthiness?" Mitnara smiles thinly. "I have not done so, but if my words made you question yourselves, all you need to prove me wrong is to aid me." "Ha!" Another voice breaks the ensuing quiet, a tall, one-eyed man joining the group in front of us. "I like you, girl." He chuckles and bows. "Olaf One-Eye." He introduces himself. "My sword is yours." "Balgruf's ancestor." I mutter loudly enough to be heard. "You ought to be worth something." He smirks at me. I see my descendants have not yet lost their mettle. "Far from it," I smile back at the man and we both turn to the rest. "As are our blades and words." The other old man from within the group speaks up. "We have failed in our task once. The chance to face the worm once more is not one we will miss." Feldir speaks rightly. The woman in the group grins. Alduin's bane is here, and our shouts shall rend the air in her name. She bows her head to Minthara. Gormleth Golden Hilt will fight for you. As will I. The tall man beside her steps up as well, another man cursed with a lack of depth perception, and bows before her. Hakon is the name. It would seem your words have managed to stir some of our restless brothers and sisters. Ysgramor speaks once again. Many will seek to join you now, but they need time yet to gather their courage. He grins at the grumbling crowd. I, for one, will not hesitate. The leader of the Atmarans grinned and grasped his disgusting axe. Ysgramor shall go to war once again. He pauses, his grin widening, and grabs a nearby tankard. But before any great battle, there must come a feast. A cheer breaks out, and both Minthara and I immediately deadpan. Fucking Nords. Windcaller just scratches his head and lets out a wry chuckle. Chapter 375, The Fateful Moment. It took the honored dead less than a minute to gather the food and drinks, a number of them stepping into the center that was not the center of the hall with instruments of all kinds, and promptly breaking into an admittedly enjoyable composition, even if the style was likely antiquated beyond measure. Come, Jurgen Windcaller waves for us to follow after him. You will not shake them from their revel, and it will be some time before they are all satisfied. We are wasting time, Minthara grumbles, but follows, as do I. Time passes, differently in the hall. The first greybeard explains as he expertly dodged a thrown tankard from a rather rowdy table nearby, without even looking. And you must understand, this feast is no attempt to delay aiding you, but to say our goodbyes before the time comes. Our? I ask with a raised eyebrow. Indeed, young one, Jurgen smiles. While I have sworn myself to Kind's peace, I am more than willing to aid you in keeping the skies clear and in healing my fellows. Much like Parthenax, then, I chuckle, always skirting the line, yet remaining reticent even now. You have met the great teacher. The greybeard blinks in surprise and then gives Minthara a sidelong glance before letting out a short chuckle. Foolish of me indeed, of course you have. Suddenly, a fair bit more animated, the old man asks, does the old grayscale still ramble on for hours? He'd go on for days if he could. Minthara groans in annoyance as we are led to a table somewhat removed from the rest of the feast. He can go on and on and on about the most mundane things. I swear if I didn't need him, I'd have jumped off the mountain a dozen times already. Jurgen's eyes glint with nostalgic amusement as he laughs merrily. Oh, that does sound like the old grayscale. He shakes his head. When he first heard of my decision to follow the difficult path, he kept me atop the throat of the world for 3 days straight, so that we could discuss the ways of Kine. He gives the other old man in our group a look. What say you, Feldir? Was he the same when he taught the first tongues? The banisher of Alduin offers a faint smile, but shakes his head. He was not. His expression turns slightly pained. His abandonment of his draconic ways was quite recent when he deemed us worthy of his tutelage, and many of his instincts yet remained with him. I have no doubts that it took him many a century to finally move on. Aye, his one-eyed companion laughs loudly. The old beast was so eternally angry while teaching us, he took my eye when I made one too many a mistake in pronunciation. Hearing Hakon's retelling, Gormleth just shudders in fear. Minthara and I both share a quick look at that. Dragons being grammar Nazis wound never not be funny to me. A moment later, Ysgramor rejoins us and takes a seat, all the while hefting a small barrel of what smelled like some incredibly good mead, and then promptly gulping it all down in slurps so loud I kind of felt like slapping the bloody barbarian. That or I just didn't like him, which was far more probable. How many do you think will join us? Minthara asks in a no-nonsense manner. A lot of them seem eager, but I can't know if that is because the feast or the fight. Ysgramor finishes off his barrel, another appearing in his hand, but a moment later, and looks to Minthara. Fear grips their hearts, Dragonborn. Many will choose to remain resting in safety, but just as many will seek further glory to add to their name. Before she can respond, I hear Jurgen speak softly. To be a hero and earn one's place in this venerable hall is not to be without fear. He smiles. The most valorous are those who face their fears in those most pivotal of moments. their very lives defined by those instances of bravery or self-sacrifice. So what you are saying is they need a push, Minthara asks. You have given them all the push they need. The old man shakes his head, his smile not leaving him. Now is the time to have patience, lest you push them from their current path. Fine, I will wait, but not forever. She nods and holds out a hand to me, perfectly catching the bottle of not afterlife mead I summoned from my storage and raising it up in a silent salute. You do not seem troubled, elf. Ysgramor's voice draws me from my observation of the Great All, a full minute having passed since Minthara got her drink and descended into warriors' small talk with the rest of them. The name is Raven. I give him a flat look, to which he just grins, and while I am quite terrified of what is to come, I know we have a fair chance at victory. All the preparations I could make, I have made. There is no use in panicking now. I envy that, the Atmaran admits with a respectful nod. The time before battle is always the worst for most of us, the waiting draining us more than the fight itself. It would seem you have misunderstood me then. I smile ruefully. My time before the battle is measured in years. For me, the battle has already begun. We just haven't started shouting yet. Ha! The ancient man snorts. You clever men always were odd in thought and in act. I shall take that as a compliment. I smirk, though I will admit some confusion. Ask away, my newest comrade. Ysgramor waves for me to go on. I will admit that almost threw me off. Exactly that. I point at him with narrowed eyes. From your histories and even your weapon, I had gotten a rather clear impression you quite hated elves. Your behavior now is odd. All the levity leaves him then. My enmity with the merfolk is an unfortunate one. The Atmaran sigs, leaning back into his seat. I will admit that I did hate all those with pointed ears for a time. We did not start off as enemies, you know, us and the Falmer. He explains, the lands were vast and our numbers small, far too small for any true conflict back then. He takes another large gulp of his drink and lets out a long exhale, and yet us humans grew in number at a speed that far surpassed our new neighbors and partners, and in their fear for the future of their kind they struck at us, slaying many and maiming many more. They wanted to starve you. My eyes narrow. He had said not a single lie since he sat with me. Quite right. He nods gravely. Our healers were not nearly as skilled as their own, and those that studied the healing ways from the elves they knew of and had slain first. A tinge of ancient fury enters his voice. Our numbers were dwindled greatly, and all that we could do was strike back before they finished us off. He lets out a sad chuckle. Not that I cared for that at the time. My wife and son were slain on that fateful day, see, and my fury was so great I could think of nothing but slaying as many of those knife-ear. He clears his throat, as many of my foes as possible. Snorting at the almost pelinal moment, I wave him off. Worry not about giving offense, old man. I know you do not mean it. He looks like he wants to ask me exactly how I could know that when I had just met him minutes ago, but thinks better of it and continues with his tale. By the time my rage had cooled, the Falmer were greatly reduced. He looks into the distance, but as I prepared myself to bury my fury and offer peace, the snow elves accepted the offer of their underground dwelling brethren and were turned to slaves. The Dwemer, for all their insight, were rather wretched. I nod. Great was my merriment when Jurgen told me of their passing. Ysgramor bares his teeth in a grin before schooling his expression, but to end my tale, old age had granted me wisdom and understanding, and to my regret, it is only then that I understood that not all the snow elves attacked us, but only a Daedra worshipping sect among their number. I never saw another snow elf in my lifetime. Do you know which Daedra? My eyes narrow. I do not. He sighs. I had died not long after the revelation, and my mortal concerns were removed from me. He shakes his head and pats his weapon. As for my axe, it was my burden to bear, and a reminder of what I had done. Forever I swore I would only wield it for a cause truly righteous. This has been enlightening, I mutter, genuinely surprised at how different the man was from my expectations. Oh, I perk up and give him a merry grin. You will be happy to hear that I have managed to repair some of the Falmer. Not in great number, sadly, but they are under my protection now. The Atmaran's mouth falls open as he gapes at me. Truly, he whispers before offering me a wide grin. Had I needed a reason to aid you, know that this would have earned my axe 1,000 times over. You really regretted your actions back then? I ask softly. He just nods. We descend into quiet contemplation, the noise of the feast paradoxically not loud enough to distract us, even as people right next to us roared out their cheers. So distracted had I become with my thoughts that I did not notice an unfamiliar figure approach. A tall man, clad in full steel plate of Nordic make, shook my shoulder and nearly earned a firebolt to the face, had I not immediately felt the familiar feeling of kinship within him. He merely signed for me to follow him and led me away from the feast, none of them noticing my sudden absence as I was slowly led toward what I soon recognized as the supposed throne of Shor himself. The armor-clad figure, whom I had just noticed, was not armor-clad, but an animated suit of armor in truth, stepped before the throne where a small crystal bottle awaited, a singular drop of crimson liquid levitating at the exact center of it. My blood roared at the sight of it. The figure picked the bottle up reverently and turned to me in an almost ritualistic fashion. They bowed and proffered it, waiting patiently for me to take it. By the time I had even noticed what I was doing, the thing was already uncorked and the drop of blood had already gone down my throat. Minthara's POV. Brothers and sisters, Isgramor roars and steps onto the table. We have fed ourselves and watered ourselves. He speaks clearly and loudly. Great songs we have told, and listened to the sagas of old. He stomps his foot. But we have delayed our rightful quest for long enough. Mortal heroes come to our doors, facing a threat that we could not on our own. Mortal heroes come here to beseech the aid of the honored dead and stand proudly before us with fire in their hearts. My brothers and sisters, he shouts over the ensuing stomps. After we have been shown such greatness, are we to let them face the end alone? Are we to let ourselves miss the truest of tests of one's mettle? Are we to miss the chance to be Horrors once more? A loud roar of "No" greets him. Then come with me, fellows valorous. He roars at them. Let us fulfill the true purpose of this warrior's afterlife and fight the battle at the end of the world. The ensuing cheer was deafening. All 1,000 heroes of old now marched behind us. Not a single one had chosen to stay behind. Much to my surprise and no doubt Raven's, "Hold on." My eyes narrow as I search for him, only to blink as I realize he had been walking next to me for the entire time, completely and utterly silent. I went to ask him what was wrong, but the focused look in his eyes stopped me. Where there was once a vibrant glow of red, it was now accompanied by a depth that I could not quite identify, even as my blood warned me to be cautious around him. More than it usually did anyway. I will admit that I let out a loud snort as Tsun's gaze fell upon us, and I was treated to a gaping god for the second time in a day. The very whalebone bridge he guarded, shaking under the stomping weight of 1,000 armored boots. The 36 fallen heroes who had followed us here all widened their eyes and offered a loud salute to their ancestors. Greatly have I underestimated you, it would seem. Tsun spoke to me a moment after he directed a surprised look at Raven. My charges you have summoned, not a one remains in the halls. His solemn expression breaks into a proud smile. This deed is worthy of my axe's aid. Somehow the ensuing roar is even more deafening than the one inside the hall. A few minutes later, the army was gathered and organized before the great bridge, Raven's soft voice directing them into positions and organizing them into squads that would best serve to complement each other. Finally, he turned back to us, the greatest and strongest and those most invested in Alduin's doom, and spoke, "The moment we have been preparing for years is here." His eyes met mine. "How about we show the world it wasn't all just a waste of time?" I grin at him, an expression he returns only partly with a smile, and we all face the skies as planned, every tongue present shouting into the misty skies as one, "Lok Vakor!" A few seconds passed, and a part of me began to doubt the supposed ease of provoking Alduin. But a second later, a roar rose in defiance of our voices, the familiar harsh voice of Alduin cutting through the skies as he bellowed, "Ven Mul Reich!" But the mists he summoned would not fully return to their previous strength, not in a while at least, and we were all more than ready to battle them for days on end. "Keep pushing him back," I yell out. "He is bound to strike back." The tongues needed no further prompting, and all roared into the skies once more, earning another retort from the World Eater. They did. Thrice more did we clear the skies, and thrice more did our enemy pointlessly summon his fog, until he finally realized that he would not beat us so easily. Great wings beat in the skies, and soon the grand form of Alduin loomed over us. Some of the honored dead taking an instinctual step back as they beheld him, only to be reassured by their companions. "Very well." The one-eyed dragon, with a still bleeding wound in his neck, growled, even as his form remained unrestricted by Akatosh's edict. "Your defiance is the last insult I shall take from you mortals." He landed on a distant hill and reared back. "Know the fury of Alduin! Know the fury of a god!" He looked to the clear skies and shouted, "Strun ma, Gol's Yol!" The air twisted and molten rock began falling atop us. As if that would even slow us down, I scoff and ready my hammer. Chapter 376, The Fateful Deed. General POV. The great worm's shout shook the earth of Sovengard, but the heroes did not scatter as he wanted them to. Instead, only a few of them, moving back and shouting at the skies to hold back the storm of meteors. The rest of them wasted no time and charged at the beast as one, the famed hunters of their number aiming for his vulnerable spots with unerring accuracy, incapable of doing much damage, but more than able in distracting the beast and disorienting it. Their comrades, those armed with melee weapons of whom there was a far greater number, charged forth with no hesitation in their eyes and loud battle cries on their lips. The great shield thane of Shor himself, leading them at the fore, followed closely by Isgramor of Atmora and Olaf One-Eye of Whiterun. Minthara's very soul was screaming at her to follow them, but she had better control than that, and awaited an opportunity with the rest of the tongues present that were not warding off the storm above them. Alduin's snout shook violently as an arrow hit his empty eye socket, doing no true damage but sending him reeling with a growl of pain, the fury in his remaining eye burning brightly. He reared back and suddenly burst forward, scything through a dozen heroes in a single movement and only getting stopped by Tsun's powerful axe swings that made him swerve to the side and simply roll over a particularly unlucky swordsman. Within the same movement, Alduin straightened himself and made an odd, if still fearsome, hop of the ground, his wings beating and the word of flight already at the tip of his tongue. Yet he would be given no opportunity to wreak havoc, as 5 voices joined as one and shouted, "Yours are Frul!" cutting off his path and inflicting weakness upon his body. Alduin's wings beat uselessly, and he was sent falling to the ground, but he was unsurprised by this and immediately growled, "Sahrot Ra Slen," sending new might flowing through his massive body and easily deflecting the slash of Olaf One-Eye aimed at his throat, crushing the ancient dragon trapper under his grip and leaving only a bloody smear. His desire to gloat would have to wait, though, as the great axe Wuthrad found itself lodged in the offending hand, shearing off a claw before the dragon could retaliate, and even then he was held back by the dogged pursuit of Tsun, who brought his own axe to bear and warded off the lethal counterstrike aiming for Isgramor's head. The dragon's other limbs were not nearly as harried, however, as his tail killed entire groups with each swing, and his other claws rent the heroic souls asunder with each rapid grasp. So enraged was he that he failed to notice a comparatively small shadow hovering above him, the shout of Kren Slen S-Os, slamming into his still weakened scales and cutting massive bloody gashes all across his body. The World Eater howled and looked up just in time to see his prophesied nemesis falling upon him with crimson scales covering a good part of her face, her blue eyes narrowed in draconic slits and her hammer already mid-swing. He moved to dodge aside, only to suddenly be slammed by a spike of earth-turned steel that was not there a moment ago. His retreat was equally blocked as more and more of said spikes gouged small wounds into his sides, the entire spell easily recognized as coming from the winged figure above, one almost as hated as the Dovahkiin. He could only raise both hands in defense, growling hatefully as his bones cracked under the weight of the enchanted hammer and began to mend themselves, and suffering a new slew of attacks to his sides. The winged elf never stopped with his spells, however, and Alduin knew that he would have to deal with him if he wanted to focus on his youngest sibling. His mind raced as he engaged in a rapid exchange with Minthara, their rapid exchange of shouts and strikes forcing the heroic band back, and when a blast of wind struck him in the snout, he suddenly remembered that the elf had been unable to resist his manipulation of time. Grinning hungrily, Alduin roared a simple "Fusro da" at his sibling, forcing her to turn ethereal for a moment to resist the thunderous force, and immediately using the opportunity to chain into a follow-up shout, "Bo ven lock teed," his entire form blurring in an instant and launching him upward as the Dragonborn could do naught but watch while she awaited her shout's effect's end. But to his surprise, the elf was still moving at the exactly same speed, teleporting out of the way the moment the first letter of the whirlwind sprint came to Alduin's mind. Growling with annoyance, Alduin commanded, "Hadrim vonun," and the elf suddenly turned a lot more cautious, moving around constantly and never standing in one place. For all his accomplishment in countering the elf's capabilities, Alduin was not left unpunished for his words. Storms of fire, ice, and lightning came from every direction, the very air transforming into volatile magicka, which was then immediately hurled into the World Eater's hide, only to be followed by another strike a moment later. And as if that was not enough, Raven gleefully used Sovengard's malleable nature to turn the very air Alduin was trying to use to shout into a sea of razor blades. Very fragile by their own nature, but more than enough to cause immeasurable pain to his opponent each time he took a breath. Another series of dragon-wren shouts covered the skies, and Alduin was forced to move away, passing hundreds of meters in a split second and just barely managing to avoid getting clipped by Minthara's own shout. His entire maw was now bleeding, though, as he was made to use shout after shout to keep dodging the dragon-rending curse that would just not stop coming. Such was his rage in that moment that he forsook his pride and used the immense reserves of magicka piled within this divine form to impose his will upon the world. All the blood which flowed from him stopped its fall and floated in the air, all of it elongating and turning to large cursed spears, with only a nudge from his grand will and aiming for the army of heroes below. He did not bother aiming for the elf, however. For all his power, he knew he was not skilled enough to punch through his wards if he were defending himself alone, but if he were to target the entire defenseless army with cursed god's blood. Just as he expected, the elf's eyes widened as he beheld the future of the army, and he immediately teleported to a hover just above ground, a massive ward covering all of them as he slammed his staff into the dirt. And then all of the spikes aimed directly at him. It was the difference of a millisecond that decided the fate of Alduin's gambit, as a metal figure formed behind the elf, taller than most mortals, and started piling ward upon ward upon ward in front of him. But just as the spears were about to reach the ward, they all swerved to the side, all of them aiming to the Dovahkiin, who was also trying to help her ally as best as she could. Her eyes, and those of the elf, widened briefly, but not swiftly enough for them to react. Much to Alduin's utter fury, others yet occupied the battlefield, and in an act of self-sacrifice bereft of any hesitation, Tsun shoved Minthara out of the way and was nearly turned to a smear of blood as almost every part of his form was struck with blood spears. As the World Eater allowed himself a short gloating huff at the death of the annoying guardian, Raven wasted no time on worry like Minthara did, and his eyes suddenly lit up with a familiar glow of greenish-blue cyan of the Eye of Magnus. And then Sovengard began to unravel. A storm of purple flames began dancing in the skies, so great in numbers that the entire horizon had been overtaken by the swirl of flaming bolts. The very sky they danced in becoming part of the apocalyptic spell, so much so that in that moment Sovengard was almost turned into yet another star in the skies. Raven grunted as his gauntlets started emitting a hissing noise, and smoke began leaving them wherever it could. His rings so burdened by the eye that he almost overdrew even with their specific enchantment hard at work. And just as Sovengard was about to well and truly pop under Magnus's gaze, Raven released the spell. Alduin's senses screamed at him that death was coming, and all he could do in that moment was roar out as many words as he could before the sea of flames struck him. Uls QRVR, followed swiftly by Strunmar. A mere second had passed since the spell began forming, and he had no further time to prepare himself as the firestorm finally came upon him. The purple flames, cursed to oblivion and back, and charged with the aura of Mehrunes Dagon himself, bit at Alduin's enhanced scales and burned harshly through his unhealing wounds. All he could do was keep curling closer and closer around himself in hopes of surviving as pain overwhelmed all of his senses. It was that same pain which made him forget that he was facing an army, and a moment later he was slammed with another quintet of Ren curses, allowing the flames to cut through his scales and begin frying him alive. His mind blanked, and the divine power he so proudly leashed to his will escaped its bounds, allowing even more fire to reach through his defenses and unleashing pure destruction upon the land. 100 heroes practically disappeared as the wave of blackness struck their already reduced army, only the sudden appearance of a smoky grey aura covering them, preventing the rest of them from meeting such a fate. Raven's crouched form panted as he forced more and more of his recently enhanced divine aura forward, countering the wild release of what was effectively a wave conceptual end energy, as his mind could best describe it in its current rattled state. The spell had taken a lot out of him, and he was still reeling from channeling so much magicka through him that he went straight through the delicious high and into the hangover. A wild berserk roar drew his eyes up, and what he saw made him both grin and sigh at the same time, as the utterly roasted form of Alduin barreled towards the remnants of the army with reckless abandon. Not even a new wave of 4 dragon wrens from those who still had the faculties to shout, slowing him down as he descended and began devouring the still defiant souls. Raven sent a quick glance to Minthara, and she understood immediately, jumping into the fray and making sure that no further soul reached Alduin's maw with wild strikes of her hammer, even as what few he had already consumed immediately went to healing his wounds and pushing out the course still lingering on his now scaleless form. In a roar of mindless rage, Alduin's eye snapped to Raven, and the dragon immediately leapt at the one his instincts told him was guilty of wounding him. Raven tried getting up with the help of a Kulakan, but the dragon was far swifter than previously, and the automaton was nearly rent asunder as it was batted away, and a now clawless hand, courtesy of the dragonborn punishing him for escaping, slammed into Raven, sending him flying away and breaking numerous bones, and most notably his neck, as his armor did not so much as cushion the divine gut punch. There was a tiny twist in the air, and all saw Raven's body break in two and fall upon the ground like so much wet rag. Alduin let out a triumphant roar as his faculties began returning to him, his pain all but gone under the sheer glee he felt at the sight of his downed foe, the same creature who had defied him so many times over. Feasting on soul, which now weakly floated in the air, shall be a delight he had not felt since his dominion of the mortal world. So gleeful was he about the confirmed death of his enemy that he outright ignored an arrow lodging into his empty eye socket. They'd get their turn, he thought happily as his maw went wide open and he stepped forward to devour the elf's soul. Minthara, who had appeared near the now corpse a mere instant later, stared at the fallen remains and blinked. She could feel the soul hanging about and moving slowly away as it was dragged towards some form of afterlife. She blinked again, and then everything went red. Jor Kreen Zar Frul, Raven's POV. Just as planned, I grin and mentally apologize to Minthara as my soul form bursts away from my not corpse. My body on the ground was perfectly fine, as the effects of my robes turned me incorporeal and allowed me to teleport away in an instant. While time slowed so quickly, even Alduin did not have time to react to what I did next. All the life force held within the mortal's razor, some of it even belonging to Alduin himself, I directed into one singular spell, an illusion so powerful it would make Alduin believe he devoured my soul when he ate it, and all the others truly believe I was well and truly gone. The manipulation would no doubt earn me a rather earned kick in the dick, but the decisive moment was approaching, and she needed all the hate she could get to push into that shout. A shout which left a perfect opening for yours truly to do his work. My soul form, which had grown quite engorged ever since I got a sip of some of that Lorcan juice from Shaw's avatar in the hall, flew rapidly into the skies, Oriel's bow brimming with power in my hand as my shroud perfectly concealed my aura and what I was about to do. On the ground, I saw Mitnara absolutely go wild with how she was smacking Alduin around, who was so weakened by the shout he could barely retaliate as he was quite literally being thrown around, with each strike sounding louder than a thunder crack. I could already see his wings start beating, his instincts preparing for an escape before his mind could catch up, and that just wouldn't bloody do. The situation called for some thorough fuckery, and so I decided to do something I avoided like the plague. I began to pray. Dagon, I intoned, destroy my enemies. And Oriel's bow was covered in a destructive aura. It would seem the Aedra and Daedra were all watching, as they should. Good. Akatosh, I continued, punish your traitorous child, followed by another crackle of golden power. Mephala, hide me from my target. My shroud's aura enshrouded the bow. Kine, may your winds guide my strike true. The winds around me began picking up. And then came the most important I would beseech, O Magnus. I intoned even louder, grant me the tools to reach my goal, grant me magic immeasurable. The architect of the world responded immediately, and his staff, which I brought out, began to transform. The bottom gained a groove and ethereal fletching, while the 4 spikes atop the staff began twisting around each other, all of them entwining so perfectly, their form now represented a spiked arrowhead. I wanted to end it all with this strike, but before Magnus's gaze finally left me, he warned me it would not be enough. I could not kill him with this, so all I could do was ensure he could never again escape us. As I prepared my strike, a stray thought wormed itself into my mind, and I smirked. Dagoth, I whispered now as I prepared to loose my arrow, defy the false divine. Power burst from within me far greater than even when I blocked Alduin's own might, all of it flowing into Magnus's staff that was now an arrow. And then I loosed. Time seemed to slow down as the arrow sailed through the turbulent skies, and yet it was neither slowed nor was it thrown off target. I saw Minthara slam Alduin's remaining horn off his head, even as he failed again and again to regenerate, and I saw her hit his jaw, but a moment later, the movement making him rear back just perfectly for my strike to meet its target. You forgot to refresh your seer block, bitch, I muttered with a grin and watched. I watched as the arrow slammed into his back. I watched as his wings were sent flying away from his body and his tail was rent from his back. I watched as the ensuing explosion sent him reeling forward into yet another slam from Minthara's hammer, which completely removed the right side of his jaw, even as he tried dodging, screaming in pain as he was. So potent was the magic charged within the now disintegrated staff that should Alduin survive, he would never have wings nor a tail again. Not that I would ever permit something like that, I thought, and reappeared next to my body, slipping into it as if putting on a pair of socks and standing up. My illusion was gone, and a couple of the heroic huntsmen looked at me with widened eyes and then at the destruction below Alduin's body. I paid them no attention, however, as in a wild flail Alduin had just managed to push Minthara away, and his jaws were just about to grasp the form of Feldir, the only man still standing from the trio who banished him all those eras ago. My hand was already grasping the razor and mid-swing when I cracked the increasingly malleable space of Sovengard and appeared below him, ramming the whole thing into his gaping jaws and outright exploding his entire snout. The ensuing roar of pain was almost saddening to hear. Minthara ignored the suddenness my presence for the moment, immediately taking the opportunity and leaping up, her hammer held in both hands, before slamming it down atop Alduin's head and pulping the fucker's brains on the spot. I was rather miffed then, as his claws began swinging around wildly, ripping Feldir apart and almost doing the same as Minthara had it not been for Ysgramor leaping in front of her and losing his left arm for the trouble. Well then, I mutter as I deflect a pathetically weak backswing of his left hand with blasphemy, if the brain doesn't work, then the heart will. Yes, I hear Minthara hiss next to me, still refusing to meet my eyes. Let us dig the black thing out. And she leapt forward again, the spike of her hammer digging into the still flailing god's chest, as she quite literally began digging through him with wide and powerful swings. My other staff, and my only staff now, extended in my hand, and I began casting spell after spell. My magicka was well and truly burnt out by now, but the dregs could still affect the Sovengard air enough to penetrate Alduin's weakened form, and especially his innards. Alduin's pained roars grow quieter with each moment, and in a last-ditch attempt to save himself, he tries to roll away and slam both his hands into his sides at the same time, inevitably pulping whoever was quite literally digging through him. I allowed no such nonsense, as a syringe of magicka potion slammed into my neck without a care about the ensuing pain, and I felt the power begin bubbling in my blood anew. Spikes rose from the ground, transforming from earth to iron to steel, and then to orichalcum. As I pushed my mind further than ever, some of them blocked Alduin's side, some blocked his hands, and some blocked the opening in his chest, just in bloody case. I effectively had him crucified by the time Minthara roared a roar of her own and quite literally pulled the fucker's heart out, slamming it into the ground and delivering another swing into his neck, just for good measure. The battlefield turned dead silent then, and even before the remaining Nord heroes could break into their loud cheering, the blood of Alduin's heart began flowing upwards and then slammed into Minthara's chest, or at least the amulet hanging off it. A downright unimaginable amount of power flowed into the Amulet of Kings, and by the time the storm of blood subsided, Minthara had slumped against Alduin's dead head, and a new gem could be seen glinting in the ancient symbol of Akatosh's favor. All the Nords were kneeling now, even those who had their brains hanging from their heads, and then her eyes met mine, and the air around me went cold. Before I could so much as blink, I was enveloped in a bone-crushing hug. Quite literally, as I could hear my bones creaking, "Mercy," I croaked, as Minthara decided to hug me even closer and promptly knee me in the dick. All I got in response to my pained groan was a cruel and emotionless glare, accompanied by a thin smile which held no warmth. Only the hidden hunger in the depths of those blue eyes made me think I was not about to die, though I would no doubt come close. It would seem I was indeed in terrible danger. Sahrot Ra Slen means might God flesh. Kren Slen SOS means break flesh blood. Boven Loktid means fly wind sky time. Hadrim Vonen means mind unseen. Uls Qaa Vir means forever, or eternal in this context. Hide armor undying. Strunma means mountain. Jor Kreens are Frul means mortal slay finite temporary. Chapter 377. Leaving Sovengard. My impending and certain doom is postponed, thankfully, as a cough that was more of a gurgle drew our eyes away from each other. The whole riddled form of Tsun stood there looking at us both with eyes filled with respect, as his numerous wounds could be seen closing down in real time. As a thank you for no doubt saving me, I immediately blasted the man Chudok god with a wave of healing magic, the spell spreading out to the rest of them, but doing nothing as they were all purely soul-based beings. They were getting healed by Sovengard itself, though so they should be out of danger now. Tsun gave me a quick, grateful nod before refocusing on the triumphant hero of prophecy. Minthara, being a rather self-conscious person, whenever her emotions aren't behind the proverbial wheels, immediately backs off with a blush and meets the massive lesser god's eyes. Her yet sharp gaze softens immediately as she sees his state, but relaxes just as quickly as she realizes he would live. A few seconds later, his throat is healed and he speaks with some difficulty, "Dragonborn." He looks to me and nods Dagoth. Before looking back at her, "Your deed this day is one of the mightiest I have ever had the privilege of beholding." He offers us both an earnest bow. "The halls of Shore shall sing of your valor until the end of time." Those heroes who are able to stand, and even some who are not, begin banging on their shields and weapons in a slow salute. "Our deed?" Minthara asks with some minor annoyance. "I do believe it wasn't just the two of us." She gives me a light glare. "Who battled the beast?" She shakes her head and raises her hammer, the amulet on her neck glowing with power. "No, it was all of us who fell the worm. So celebrate your own deeds, as you would ours, for you have proven your valor 1,000 times over on this day." The previously solemn banging swiftly turns into a roaring cheer, or merrily raised limbs in the case of those who could not quite yet speak. Your words are as mighty as your hammer, it would seem. Tsun smiles at her, and yeah. Before he can finish speaking, we all feel a burst of power come from Alduin's corpse. My eyes immediately narrow, and blasphemy is already in my hands and a shout on my lips by the time I turn around, only to find a black mist slowly wafting off the fallen dragon's corpse. Oh no you don't, I growl and replace my glaive with the mortal's razor. But a distant yet omnipresent stare stops me in my tracks as I feel a duo of grand golden eyes stare down at me. I stare back without fear, my hand still clutching at my weapon as the nearly incomprehensible being that was Akatosh temporarily ceased tugging at his son's soul. Then a series of images began bombarding myself and Minthara, whose presence I could feel being a part of the conversation. Images of praise and glory for us came from the chief divine, but also images of temperance and of caution, as he effectively explained that he was not trying to save Alduin's soul, but make sure his power could not be taken by anyone. Part of me considered pointing out that Minthara should have it, but a larger one knew that she was nowhere near ready to handle that kind of thing yet, and neither was I for that matter. Something Akatosh noticed almost immediately as his eyes shone with approval and a downright ginormous clawed hand appeared in our not-quite sights as he pointed at his newest child and promptly blasted her with a wave of golden power easily equivalent to a dozen dragon souls, and all of it made to fit her perfectly. A small sliver of it also entered my own amulet, giving it a nice little boost. In the next instant, the vision was gone. As was Alduin's body and soul, not even the scales were left behind for me to tinker with, as they no doubt held some of the divinity held by the fucker. And Akatosh had just finessed me out of said bits by distracting me. Whatever, I roll my eyes and turn back to the heroes. I was too tired for this shit anyway. Minthara soon joined me as well, even if she looked to be quite distracted by the new power boost. She shakes her head and wisely shoves it for later. You were about to say something? She asks soon as if nothing had just happened. Something the minor god wisely follows as he nods. Indeed, Dragonborn. He pauses hesitantly before continuing. The souls of the still living are not meant to be in this place for long, and while you have earned your spot 1,000 times over, I recommend against remaining any longer. He then gives me a long look, but says nothing, the implication that I could probably exist in Lorcan's domain, permanently quite clear to the both of us. But neither he or I wanted me to stay here. Already sick of us, eh? Minthara huffs, a thin smile on her lips. Apologies. Tsun bows his head. Though know that your mighty deed will not go unrewarded by us, even if I can feel your own divine sire has taken care of that quite thoroughly. She crosses her arms and gives him a smug look. More power is always good. Indeed, Dragonborn. Tsun moves out of the way as Ysgramor steps forward, followed closely by Jurgen Windcaller, whose throat had yet to heal from being ripped out, and a hesitant Ulfric Stormcloak. You have earned the allegiance of the Hall of Valor, and for that we offer you our aid, whenever and wherever you may call us. Jurgen inclines his head, and his voice manifests all around us. When aid you require, simply voice these words, and we shall answer. Hun Karl Zor. She leans away for a moment and then blinks, a radiant smile overtaking her expression. Thanks. I will be sure not to throw you lot at all of my enemies. Hesitate not, sister, Ysgramor grins. This great battle has awakened my thirst for glory and merely wasting away my afterlife in a… What did you call it? He tilts his head and pretends to think. A pointless existence. It just won't do. He smirks as she looks away, earning a chuckle from all of us. Can someone please help me up already? A frustrated and oddly familiar voice calls from below us, swiftly revealing a quite thoroughly bifurcated Gormley glaring at us from the dirt. Some gentleman you are, not helping a woman just because she has her guts out. She huffs, much to the roaring laughter of her peers. Noticing my confused look, Tsun gives me a mildly smug one in turn. They are souls, child. All who were not devoured will recover after a time. Both of my eyebrows shoot up in surprise, and I swiftly shake away a relieved smile. While I did respect the heroes of Sovengard somewhat, I did not hesitate for even a second to use them all as disposable cannon fodder. In fact, I did not so much as blink, as they were torn apart and flattened by the dozens each second as the battle went on. The fact that most of them would recover after an undetermined amount of time was a nice balm on my own callous decisions. And speaking of recovery, my mind supplied, and I turned away from the raucous bunch who were already bringing out the drinks and pestering Minthara with congratulations. As much as I had proven myself to them in battle and by quite thoroughly fucking Alduin up, they were all hesitant to turn to me, as I was still very much so an outsider, and I preferred it that way, as these were people I would most likely never see again. Ignoring the slightest tinge of disappointment that disappeared as swiftly as it came, I moved towards the crumpled form of Akulakan Jr., the light of his Ethereum core shining through the numerous rents in his armor as his remaining glowing purple eyes stared up at me. "Master?" The automaton tried to rise, but I halted him with a nudge of telekinesis. "Anything critical?" I ask as I begin examining the damage. Thankfully, all of it was quite fixable even outside of his regeneration. "No damage to the core?" "None," he responds, an almost static-like quality to his voice. A silent moment passes before he speaks up again. "I have failed you, my master." An eyebrow quirks on its own as I give him a sideways glance. "How so?" "More than once I fell to a single strike." "And what, feeling sorry for yourself?" I ask with a scoff as I send a wave of magicka-infused noise at his vocal cord equivalent. He hesitates, but answers after a moment, "I should not be feeling this." He states simply, "I am a tool, not some weakness-cursed meatbag who wallows in his own misery." I give him a long look, pausing my repairs for a moment to consider my words before speaking. For a creature who had just begun developing a soul from sheer power and deed, I don't think you calling yourself deficient really fits. He stills a soul? Yup. I smack my lips and nod. It was a tiny newborn thing that now occupied his Ethereum core, the mere existence of which filled me with both annoyance and pride. It was almost like watching a kid grow up, though admittedly more of a pet-like relation than one's own child. Damn, that was messed up. Just don't worry yourself over it too much. I chuckle as I begin levitating him up and ensuring nothing was about to blow up. You will have all the time in the world to come to terms with your new level of existence, and don't you even dare say something stupid like I should remove it so you can serve me better. Him remaining completely silent says enough about that. Knowing that there would be no true consequence, I shoved him into my storage and walked back to the group of heroes who were now frantically gathering the remains of their fellows. The soul meat wiggling about as it tried crawling back together on sheer instinct and divine blessing. Kinda disgusting now that I think about it. "Done saying your goodbyes?" I ask Minthara as I approach her from her left. "Yeah," she says quietly, refusing to look at me for the moment. "It is sad that we are leaving so quickly. They've all grown on me." "Well, it isn't like you won't be able to summon them whenever you wish." I chuckle and look to Tsun. "Ready to do whatever it is you were intending?" He nods. "Indeed, just say the word and I will send you back to Nian." Minthara gives the heroes one last look as they offer a final salute to us, with their weapons raised, and nods at Tsun. "Return now to the bounty of Nirn, heroes great," he proclaims after a moment's pause, "and may we welcome you both back after your time upon the lands is done. Ne hl dal vus." A wave of power hits us, and we are gone. The first thing we hear as we are transposed by Tsun's shout. A small part of me wanted to wring his neck for only now remembering something that could banish someone from Sovengard, but I doubted it was powerful enough to contest with Alduin's voice and power. Were the numerous shouts of dragons whose presence I could feel even before my eyes rapidly readjusted to our new environment. The 4 or so dozen dragons all sounded downright jubilant as they declared to the world, "Alduin Mahlan," in almost perfect synchronicity. Almost as if they were beginning some kind of obituary chant, a small part of me noted, "Sahrot Thur Kahran." Dova Keen. The calm voice of Parthenax draws me from the skyborn spectacle. "It is done then. Alduin is slain?" he asks hesitantly. Knowing that Parthenax still partly loved his older brother, Minthara did not gloat and instead nodded. "He is dead," her tone one of finality. "He has brought his fate upon himself." The old dragon laments and lowers his head. "I know this as I know the sun rises in the east, and yet he was my brother once, and I will mourn him for many passes of the moons. The world shall never be the same. Alduin Mahlan, the skyborn dragons declare again, Dovakin los Dovakreed. Perhaps Zaymar, the only other dragon who did not join the dance in the skies, speaks up as Krine steps forward. It is time you moved on from that ancient conflict. Time-born, we may be, but timeless in truth we are not, and living in but one moment is to turn our boon into a curse. Alduin Mahlan, the not-quite dirge, continues, Thu umi I los nalot. You speak wisdom, brother. Parthenax lets out a long exhale, but it will take me much to move on from this. Not if I have anything to say about it. I hear Minthara mutter to herself, her devious streak no doubt already at work to kick old party snacks into gear. The dragons begin landing all around us, occupying the jagged rocks and peaks surrounding the clearing at the throat of the world, Alduin Mahlan. They all intone as one and all as one lower their heads, Dovahkin Losthur. Well now, I smirked, my thoughts already considering the implications. Minthara, on the other hand, just gawked. Hunkal Zor means hero champion legend. Nechel Dal Vus means living return Nirn. Alduin Mahlan means Alduin has fallen. Sahrot Thur Kahran means the great overlord is vanquished. Dovakin Losoke Dovakreed means slain by the dragonborn. Thu Umai Los Nalot means his voice is silenced. Dovakin Los Thur means our lord is now the dragonborn. Chapter 378, Spreading the News. General POV. We've got another. The sudden shout brought Torrig from the depths of his thoughts and worries as a quartet of hale warriors ran past him, carrying the wounded form of whom he swiftly recognized as Balgruf's own niece to the nearby space the healers sectioned off to tend to the wounded. His eyes met those of his currently most powerful Jarl as the man also realized what had just happened and barely held himself back from rushing after them. Damnation! The Jarl of Whiterun hissed and stopped himself from following. Any news of your brother? Torrig chose to try and distract him. His own nerves were threatening to make him go mad, and he could do with some empty talk as well. Nay, my king. Balgruf shook his head and leaned on the wall behind him. Hrongar is still chasing after whatever pockets of resistance are left. He and a good number of the fools too nervous to wait. His face twisted into a light scowl. As if the two of us are any less guilty of shaking in our boots. Torrig lets out a quiet chuckle, his eyes automatically moving towards the closed portal to Sovengard itself. Balgruf joins him in his short bout of self-deprecating laughter and shakes his head. If only the bloody dragons said anything before flying off, at least we might have had some peace of mind. His eyes trail to an almost completely concealed corner of the platform. The Breton woman looked just about ready to try and chase after them. All we can do is hope that the gods have chosen their champion well. Torrig too leans upon the wall behind him, standing just opposite his vassal. Well, he adds with a wry look, their champion and whatever Raven is. Balgruf just snorts at that. Before they can speak further, however, the few housecarls who had remained with their charges, Bolgear, Bearclaw and Irileth among them, all tensed up as magic began twisting the air between them, but relaxed almost immediately as the familiar form of the Argonian archmage appeared. Balgruf immediately stood straight. "Have you revealed anything, Master Mage?" Torrig almost blurted the same, but was thankfully spared the embarrassment. The tiny Argonian just smiled at them and kept looking at the dormant portal, his colleagues swiftly joining him as they too realized something was happening, and as the nearby crowd realized that something was going on, they too began gathering hesitantly. And then, as if by some divine choreography, the moment the last person stood, the space around the portal twisted and too very familiar. If somewhat battered in the woman's case, figures appeared with a loud crack of air being displaced. A complete and utter silence descended upon the summit of Skuldafn, many ceasing to even breathe as they stared on with anticipation. Torrig was equally expectant, even if his eyes were drawn to a particularly familiar-looking amulet hanging off the Dragonborn's neck. Raven's POV. I was almost tempted to fuck with the lot of them, but even my need to fuck with people had its limits, and I gave the gathered crowd a shallow nod as Minthara rose her hammer and shouted, "Victory is ours." There was a pause then, before the entire crowd erupted into a storm of confused questions, cheers, and sighs of relief, many of them falling on their asses, and among those some were now shedding tears. "Oh," I coo silently, "isn't that nice?" Only to earn an elbow into my hip in the same instant from an equally amused Minthara. "Let them have this, Raven. They did their part." "You don't see me stopping them." I shrug and give the approaching nobles and Archmagi a wave. Savos looked particularly relieved to see me, as the elf looked like a ton had just been removed from his back, even if Tolfdir himself, out of all people, looked to be in a similar predicament. "Student," Shalazar appears in front of me with a merry squeak. "Your survival was in no doubt for even a moment, but I must know, have you taught that lizard of lesser inclinations of its most deserved place?" He grins up at me expectantly. "But of course, master." I grin back. There can after all be only one. We both nod sagely at that, and he gives me a look as if to say that we should talk later. That is all the words I get in before Savos too approaches me and gives me a quick hug and a tap on the back. "I am happy you did not die in there," he whispers. As if Gramps, I huff with faux disdain and hug him back. As if. More and more greetings and pats on the back, both literal and metaphorical, are shared as everyone tries to get a word in before Torrig finally speaks. His eyes focused completely on Minthara's amulet, even as he tried to look up. "Your deeds this day will be remembered for many eras to come, of course, but I must ask, is that the Amulet of Kings?" "Yes." Minthara grins. "Apparently my father?" She tilts her head. "Yes, father." She nods and goes on. "Decided that our deed was worthy of the pact being reforged once again. No Daedric invasion shall happen while I still live." Her choice of words earned her some odd looks, but no one was quite deficient enough to point out that she was not supposed to live for a noticeably long time as far as interplanar invasions are concerned. Bloody idiots, she was even more ageless than I at this point. I thought, but pointedly and rather pettily, did not correct the implied misunderstanding. Now, I cut in with a sly smirk. "I think that is enough questioning for the day. Or have we died and gone to an alternate dimension where the Nords of all people don't know what happens after a great battle?" Torrig immediately caught on and let out an awkward chuckle. "How utterly foolish of me, Raven." He turned around. "My friend is right, my brave brothers and sisters. Bring out the mead." Naturally, a mad cheer follows. Chuckling at his sudden eagerness, I tapped his shoulder and whispered, "I do believe I have a better place for drinking than the ruins of a dragon cult temple." He scratches the back of his head and nods. "Right," and once more turns to the rowdy crowd. "To the portal." The cheers are slightly less enthusiastic, but people are quick enough to follow, and soon we find ourselves marching to the portal. Naturally, after I got to work and ensured no one else would die. I did notice from the corner of my eye as Minthara picked up the dragon priest's mask, no doubt remembering my ramblings about that one spot in Labyrinthian. A mere hour later, we found ourselves within the massive hall of Tel Dagoth, surrounded by a wall of noise and the smell of alcohol and food. Predominantly the drink, though. All of those who participated in the final assault were celebrating harder than I thought possible, and I held no doubts a few hundred kids would be born some 9 months from now. They did just survive the end of the world, so it wasn't as if I had any right to judge them, not that I would. "Ask your question, Durak." I grin up at the Orsimer with a slight smirk. Minthara and I had been practically forced to the head of the table, and no one let us do anything on our own, treating us like greater royalty than Torrig, who was more than content to join the wild celebrations himself. Back to my orcish friend, he shuffled somewhat awkwardly as the twins and huntress of the companions followed behind him. "Gods damn it all, Raven." He lets out a chuckle after a moment. "Tell me of the Harbinger." All 3 of his fellows lean in, and for a moment I am tempted to fabricate a tale of his soul getting devoured. But last I saw of Kodlak, the man was one of the few who survived the ordeal, almost unscathed, and I was not pissy enough to turn a joyous occasion into a lesson. So I just smiled. "We found him alongside Ulfric and his right hand." "Well, them and the ancient archmage Gulda, but I doubt you want to hear about an old enchanter." The ancient archmage got his head pasted by Alduin's tail, when he was rolling away from my final spell. He would regenerate and get what he wanted, but I have no doubts many of the heroes from Sovengard considered his whacking to be deserved. Why no? Farkas goes to speak, but his brother elbows him in the gut. Of course not, Flame Tongue. Tell us of Kodlak. Chuckling at the byplay, I shake my head and spin the tale of the old man's deeds, finishing it all by saying, and now he feasts in the Hall of Valor with the likes of Isgramor and Jurgen Windcaller. Surprised by the lack of vitriol in my voice, Durek naturally followed up with a question about the Atmaran leader, and we spent some time discussing what he told me. The companions left me with satisfied expressions, the weight completely removed from their conscience as they fell upon my stock of mead with a rabid enthusiasm only a true beast was capable of. How very subtle, Scorch drawls as he lands on my shoulder. I look up at the supreme bird boy and raise an eyebrow. You are back rather quickly. Instead of answering, he points his wings at a nearby entrance, just in time for the both of us to see Elisif storming in and promptly dragging Torrig off by the ear as the rather drunk royal came far, far too close to doing something inadvisable with one of the female legionaries. Said legionary's fate was sealed just as quickly as Tullius's gaze was drawn to the commotion, his thunderous expression promising all manner of torment upon the poor soul. You know I was about to offer my condolences, but we just came back from the afterlife, and she is annoyed. I chuckle, may her trip be swift and without issue. I declare instead, earning a snort from Minthara, who had begun listening in after she had managed to shake off Hrongar's fourth proposed toast. Her healing of Lydia had probably earned more respect from the man than the act of slaying Alduin. Perfectly understandable. I hum, children are indeed everything to most people. I pause and mutter, to most reasonable people anyway. You say something? The demi-goddess extraordinaire leans in, her 26th mug of mead laying empty in front of her as she had just now begun to understand the curse that is the existence bereft of alcohol. Just contemplating everything that happened. I half lie. It had been a measly 4 years since I materialized my way into this reality, and so much shit had happened. A satisfied smile wormed its way onto my face as I realized I did not regret a single thing. Yeah, she nods and leans back into her seat. It has been quite the wild ride. I snort, oh please, we are just getting started. That we are, she grins. The crowd hushes as the familiar form of Marco makes its way into the center of the great chamber. He seems to hesitate for a moment, but clears his throat and straightens his back. If I may ask for a moment of everyone's time? He looks mostly to me, and I raise a hand, quieting down everyone who had not done so on their own. Thank you. He offers me a light bow and a smile. He straightens back up and begins to speak. For many years I have merely followed the road set before me by those who came before, bereft of inspiration or motivation to do anything constructive with my life. He chuckles ruefully. That was before a duo of the most amazing people I know shoved their way into my life and dragged me kicking and screaming into the light. He chuckles, and some of the crowd follows suit as they were aware of his story. Allow me then to thank you both. He gives us a serious look, both for your friendship and your guidance, and for the greatest inspiration a bard could ever find in this harsh yet magnificent world. He pulls out his lute, and his magic begins emitting in waves across the whole chamber as a familiar melody enters my ears. And then he begins to sign Alduin's wings. They did darken the sky. The wave of nostalgia that hit me as the familiar song reached my ears was of such grandeur that I barely noticed a hand snaking its way around my neck, only being broken out of it as I realized I was already half dragged outside the chamber by a grinning demigod. You didn't really think you could get away. Minthara grins, and it is not one that promises safety. Did you? As I was dragged into my own room and promptly shoved inside, I gave myself a solemn nod. Today was a good day to die. Chapter 379, Interlude 4, Merriment, Panic, and More Merriment. General POV, Serio. The quiet voice of one of his aides almost made Davos jump out of his skin. His imported sujama now quite thoroughly spilled all over his best pants. He glared at his subordinate, but the Dunmer merely kept staring at him, the only sign of a reaction being the slightest upturn of the corner of her lips. "What?" Davos almost growled as he was quite deep in his cups by now. Can't a Mer enjoy his time off after nearly getting crushed a dozen times? He slurs. "Certainly, Sergio." The woman bows, the upturn turning into a full-blown smirk as she looks up at him, though the Lady Nightshade may have something to say to that, seeing as she had just gone into labor. Davos's entire body stilled as his cup outright fell out of his hand now, the nearby feast-goers giving him quick looks before returning to their revelry. "What?" The agent clears her throat. "The Lady Nye." "I heard what you bloody told me." He curses and gets up, almost stumbling as he did, and ciao. Even as he ran up the stairs, he failed to see the grin on his subordinate's face. His journey would last for a while, it seemed. A full hour later, almost fully sober now and sweating all over, Davos finally found the room he was directed at, or misdirected, as he'd grumble if he had the breath for it. As he neared the room and heard nothing coming from within, his worry started picking up, fully expecting he had been tricked again and would need to run even further in his panicked state. Only for the doors to open and one of the Falmer healers to step outside, greeting Davos with a raised eyebrow. "Is everything all right, sir?" the healer asked calmly. Davos let out a sharp breath and immediately demanded, "I am not late, am I?" "I am afraid you are quite late," the healer pointed out flatly. "Damn it all." "What?" He gaped slightly and stopped all movement as a tinge of worry went down his spine. I thought these things took time." He would end whoever sent him on this merry chase, and the fact he could not even remember the face made him that much more furious. The farmer gave him a deadpan look at that, "Sir, we are magi. Ensuring a safe and swift birth is easier than healing a mild gash." Davos's eye twitched that he forgot the same words Raven had once told him made him quite suspicious. But he had other things to worry about now, like surviving his wife-to-be's ire. "I am just going to get in now." "Right." The healer's mouth quirked up and he stepped out of the way. "Oh, and sir?" "Yes." Davos does not slow down. "Congratulations." The healer says genuinely, "Your part in the hope of our people will not be forgotten." Barely even acknowledging his words, Davos pulled the door open and stopped in his tracks. The scene he was greeted to promptly took hold of all his focus, as he beheld the woman he had come to love over their time together, looking completely fine and not even tired after the birth. But what truly drew his gaze, even as her eyes met his, was the bundle she held wrapped in a silken towel, a tiny pale creature with tufts of black hair snoozing with their eyes closed, the sight of whom filled him with both immense confusion and the unerring determination to murder anything and everything in the name of their continued happiness. Davos, Nightshade greeted him quietly and rose her hands ever so slightly. "Your son." In the blink of an eye he was next to her, daintily taking the child into his hands and feeling them both firm and shake at the same time. "What?" he croaked. "What are we going to name him?" She hesitates but swiftly firms her resolve. "I would give him a Falmer name." And quickly adds, "You must understand, he is the first true Falmer to be born in eras." Davos just rolled his eyes. "He is one, love. You have any on your mind?" "I do." She smiles beautifully and let out a quick and relieved sigh. "Varador, like one of the ancient kings." "Varador." Davos tests the name and nods. "I like it." The two hug each other in silence, Davos hesitantly returning the child to his mother's hands as he gave her a somewhat discreet look over. Now that he was finally out of his daze, he began to understand that the whole scheme was meant to make him as panicked as possible when there was no danger whatsoever. But why? "The fuck was I even worrying about?" he heard himself mutter before he could control his mouth. The vindictive gleam in Nightshade's eyes promptly informed him of all the reasoning needed, and giving it some basic thought, he found he probably deserved it. Now to spread the good news. "What do you mean he is unavailable?" The right hand of Dagoth asked the massive construct standing guard beside the entrance to his lord's chamber. "He hasn't been seen for almost a day. He is never absent for that long, without notice." Not that Davos was all that eager to spread the good news, but he knew if he did not, his boss would be an insufferable cunt about it. no doubt enacting another one of his cunning plans again. But instead of focused on destroying his enemies, it would be focused on him. Ash to that. Akula Khan merely pointed his thumb at the door, which Davos absolutely refused to accept, just shuddered, and shrugged as if to say, "You want to go in there?" And thus Davos's determination disappeared into the air as if it were never there. Right, he smacked his lips and chose life. I think I will just come back later. The cold eyes of the automaton followed him all the way as he left its line of sight, and even a bit beyond that, the gaze behind them almost feeling amused. Within the halls of the Thalmor embassy, the air was of a far less jovial nature. Would you care to repeat that, Justiciar? The High Justiciar Finarfin narrowed his eyes at the snivelling fool before him. He was only half paying attention to the young Mir's report, as he was currently far too engrossed in the news of a god being slain to truly care about the minutiae of a patrol. As you will, your lordship. The noble scion, at least, had enough backbone to keep his voice from quivering. As per your directions, we investigated the remnants of Falkreath in search of the missing executors and the disgraced ambassador. Finarfin's eyes narrowed as the justiciar paused, and, he hissed sharply, he takes a shuddering breath. We found all of them, dead without a single wound and their souls missing. His shoulders sag as if he had just thrown the metaphorical weight of the discovery at his superior. Which came quite true, Finarfin realized with a mental tsk. And not a trace of the cursed Argonian. No, my lord. The young one bows his head in apology. It would seem that whatever wounds your curse was able to deliver were countered by the beast. His lips almost quirked up as the fool saved his life by not calling his spell a failure. Still, the Argonian surviving was not good, the opposite of it in actuality. Already his rivals were circling him like vultures, waiting for any sign of weakness to pounce and take his exalted position. His failure in fully hunting down the last Arana had quite thoroughly sullied his chances at achieving his ambitions and becoming the true overlord of Alinor. A great act of victory was needed for his star to rise once more, and he knew that the only place left for such achievement was in a new great war. Leave, he commanded after a silent moment, and the aide was more than happy to follow. We will have to retreat from Skyrim. There is no getting around that, he concluded after only a minute of thought. The situation in the north was untenable, and wasting any further resources on keeping their presence here was something he could quite easily justify to the council. Now to spin the lies, he began even as he raged against the very idea of retreat. Magnificent, absolutely magnificent. Emperor Titus Mede II exclaimed to the chamber filled with his most loyal subordinates, laughing merrily as he just finished processing the message his personal mage had received on one of those marvelous new orbs Winterhold gifted him. The gods truly do favor the Empire, my friends. All of the 9 seated men and women of various races rose their cups in salute. The Empire. Not a one of them could have hoped for this kind of outcome a mere year ago, and now they considered themselves privileged to be able to bear witness to the glory that was to come. Finally, the old emperor was able to calm his joyous laughter and cleared his throat. Commander Maro, the leader of his personal guard, stood and saluted Your Majesty. I think it is high time we sped up our preparations. Titus smiled unkindly. I want the entire Vestravian family and their syndicate gone before the day is out. We were waiting for that order. The commander suppresses a grin. Not a single traitor will survive your wrath. Fucking Thalmor sellouts, the lot of them. A noble family of Cyrodiil burning a newly repaired temple to Talos. Might as well request I cut off your damnable heads instead of wasting all of our time. Titus did not allow his furious inner thoughts to show, and nodded. Go then. I will be safe for a few hours on my own. The commander saluted once more and left. Juculus, my friend. The emperor turned to his aide and chancellor as the rest of the table began paying rapt attention. I think it is high time we invited the honored heiress to return, preferably with Dagoth if she can manage it. Not that he doubted her for a moment. The two did not even bother hiding their possible relationship, and Junior was quite dutiful in her reports. I think it is high time we announced our fortune to the world, no? If you believe it to be wise, Titus. Duculus nodded a bit hesitantly. I still think you are grasping too quickly and too greedily, especially with the rumors of the level of influence a House of Morrowind has over her. He looks away. If we push too hard, we may have a rebellion on our hands. Fools will do anything with the excuse of perceived tyranny. We have limited time before the Thalmor wake up from their stupor and begin their shadow war once more, Titus pointed out with a shake of his head. We must act quickly. He pauses and grins. Besides, having both Godslayers present by our side when the time comes to cow, the council fully sounds just perfect. He knew his old friend understood his meaning then, as the Bosmer's eyes lit up, and he began composing a missive, the rest of the 9 already planning around the new move to extract as much advantage from the ensuing unrest as possible. For once, Titus felt, it was good to be emperor. Chapter 380, Interlude 5. Deep within the ashes. Within the ash-covered reaches of old Vardenfell, the sound of quiet steps broke the methodical noise of mechanical tinkering, the ever-curious work of the ancient elf, pausing just as his daughter made her presence known. Ah, Alf, my dear. The seated Mer looked up from the disassembled Dwemer spider made from blackened steel atop his table. What news do you bring from our stubborn kin? I do hope it wasn't just another routine meetup of their clans. That would be unacceptably boring. Before she could respond, the seated sorcerer, for he could be nothing else sitting at the summit of a traditional Telvanni tower, slumped his shoulders. Ever since that fool Vivek decided to play God and failed spectacularly good entertainment has been sorely missed. Why, I am almost tempted to move to the mainland. Devaith Fear looked back to his daughter Shatclone, his rant nowhere near done. Do you have any idea just how unacceptable that is? The ancient elf let out a loud scoff. Come on then, stop holding me in suspense. What happened? Viciously suppressing the urge to point out he was the one at fault, his daughter cleared her throat. There has in fact been a development you may find interesting. She told him professionally, the Daedra are moving. They always are, Divaith drawls. Why does it matter now? Because a prophecy was made. She answers, Surushtakai was present during one of the clan's meetups, and a wise woman of the Urshilaku supposedly received a vision from Azura herself. One of the oldest mortals on Nirn pauses, his eyes finally lighting up with interest. Another prophecy from Azura, you say? Alpha shot a quick look at the contraption atop her creator's table before quickly looking back at him and nodding, Indeed, and one about a name you've had great interest in for years at that. Divaith had not been this animated in centuries, startling his female clone by jumping out of his seat with an almost manic shine in his eye. What name? His voice was almost a hiss. It was said that upon hearing his clone's answer, the excited laughter of the master of the tower could be heard throughout the entirety of Tel Fir, and even the now unused dungeon beneath, the few denizens who still remained wisely did not leave their rooms for a while after that. About a day earlier, Veyrin of the House Indoril could barely keep his excitement from showing as he was led by a few bored-looking Erebenimsun warriors into the ancient and by now quite thoroughly ash-covered city of Ald'ruhn. The Ashlanders did not say a word as they led him in, through streets which were just barely cleared enough for Mer to walk properly. But the young priest was not discouraged. He had come to this place to learn the old lore of the reclamations straight from the source of the faithful Ashlander tribes, the only Dunmer sect which kept to the true gods as the false tribunal usurped their place and cursed their people for thousands of years. When the reincarnated Hortator, the great Nerevar himself, gave Vardenfell fully to the Ashlander tribes, the great houses grumbled and raged at their chosen leader, but not Veyrin's father, who understood that faith should be rewarded and folly punished, and what greater punishment for failed leaders than that of lost lands? Unfortunately, the reward of the good tribespeople was tainted for the moment. The Hortator left east, following a divine vision no doubt, the stone which was held up by the stolen power of the false god. Vivek finally fell upon the lands and made the Red Mountain erupt, destroying the promised paradise of the Ashlanders as one final petty insult from the false gods. The tenacity of your people is impressive. The young priest of Azura finally spoke, unable to bear the silence broken only by sharp winds. Not many would have the strength or courage to return to this place every year, especially not with the constant ash and firestorms. The larger of the Erebonimson clansmen let out a harsh, grating bark of laughter. "Don't compare us to you weak house Dunmer. We Ashlanders won't let anything bar us from honoring our ancestors." "Don't be too hard on the youth, brother." The smaller one gave Veyrin's back a light, to him, pat, almost making him sprawl on the ash-covered ground. If not for the training his reflexes got on the arduous journey, at least he is trying. "Which is why I even bothered answering," the older brother scoffs. "Why do you gather here anyway?" Veyrin tried dusting off the ash covering his robes on reflex before remembering how utterly futile the action was. "I've heard stories from the Redoran, but best I hear it from the Netch's mouth as well." "Netch's mouth?" The larger warrior growled and rounded on him before he could even blink. "You trying to insult us, boy?" Realizing he may have made a mistake, the young priest immediately rose his hands placatingly. "I meant no offense, Sira. It was but a turn of phrase I used." The two warriors stared down at him for a long moment before the both of them burst into amused laughter. "Of ash in course we know what you meant." The shorter brother snorts. "Bloody mainlanders think us all barbarians just because we don't wish to live in decadence." Veyrin's cheeks had by this point darkened to near purple, his eyes pointedly locked to the road below him as the duo burst into another bout of chuckles at his expense. "To answer your question, young one," the shorter brother began once they all calmed down a bit, "Aldruin is the place where all the clans united to face the Emperor Crabscar. Gathering here is a celebration of our ancestors and our shared roots and a reminder of our ancient brotherhood." It did not take a sorcerer to understand why that was a good idea, and Veyrin quickly nodded along. "I can see the wisdom of such a choice." He pointedly did not mention the version of the story where a Redoran warrior paid the Ashlanders with scraps to use them as distractions before he bravely slew the old beast. He liked his head atop his shoulders far too much for such stupidity to remove it. "Thank you most kindly." "Quite." The taller one nodded, still a bit curt, Bot seemingly warming up to the boy as their trek went on. "Can't wait for the feast myself." He pats his armored chest. The gathering of the four great clans always brings something interesting to try. "Only four?" Veyrin heard himself ask. "I've heard of many more Ashlander tribes than four." "The four great clans, boy," the taller one repeated, "the only four clans that remained on Vardenfell despite everything the world threw at us. Urshilaku the law-keepers, Ahemusa the hunters, Zainab the craftsmen and traders, and Us Erebonimson, the greatest warriors. That Urshilaku twat might challenge you again over that last bit." The shorter brother chortles. "Ashen fools can't even wear proper armor and want us to respect them. Let the chitin-worshipping traditionalists stay stupid." The taller one grins under his helmet. "More metal for the real warriors that way." "Of course, brother." The shorter one nodded. "There is no curing idiocy." He pauses a step before catching up again. "Speaking of idiocy, you got a name, young one?" Was he calling him an idiot? Or his own lack of introductions? Veyrin pondered before quickly shaking his head. "Veyrin Indaril," he voiced, "of a branch house, thankfully." "You got some false god blood in you, boy." The taller one was suddenly too close. "And you are thankful." "I do not." Veyrin once more found himself rising his hands, but this time in self-defense, as flames began to form at the tips of his fingers. "Which is the fact I was grateful for. All children of Almalexia have fled into the mountains and hills and have not been seen in years." The tall Dunmer stared at him for a while longer before giving him a clipped nod and turning back to the path. "You got some spine at least, boy. Name's Masur, remember it." "And I am Massanor." The shorter one offered a light bow, most likely one in mockery, though my brother seems to have forgotten to mention the addition to the festivities we will be having this year. "Bah!" Masur waved him off, his mood instantly reduced. "Those newcomers should not be allowed into Aldruin, hidden clan my ashen ass." "A hidden clan?" Veyrin blinked. How could there ever be a hidden clan if the whole island was scoured after Lord Nerevar's victory? "By being a bunch of suspicious and secretive Kwama buggerers," That is how. Massenor scoffed, started popping out from somewhere around the ruins of Kogorun a century or so back, ran out of food supposedly, and were forced to trade. Trade? Veyrin rose an eyebrow. No offense, but what did they even have to trade to you for food? I thought food was a commodity in these lands, especially after the eruption. We get by. Massenor half answered, and they had orichalcum, he added bluntly while unsheathing his visibly green blade. They live in underground caverns most of the time and came upon a vein an age ago. They are still mining the bloody thing to this day. The young priest could not help but smile at the revelation. This was the exact reason why he left the safety of Mournhold. How could he have ever found out something so interesting if he remained in his father's library, drowning himself in books all day? Call themselves the Darhashin. Massenor went on, not that many of them, but they are a lively lot once you get through to them, which is where the main issue lay. Bunch of recluses, the whole lot of them. Masur not quite growled, had to offer a whole stone of netch meat for the trader to even speak to me. His next words came out almost painfully. They made a fair bargain of it, though, I will give them that much. Their conversation trailed off as they finally reached a populated section of the ancient city. The chitin-hewn buildings almost all burned to a crisp or fully engulfed in ash, with only the remnants of Scar itself still standing against the elements, as if the ancient Emperor Crab's will remained long past its defeat, still refusing to bend to this day. Massenor and Masur did not leave him as he had expected them to. Instead, Veyrin found himself getting dragged around the entirety of the massive building, getting introduced to friends and family, and offered food. It was a truly heartwarming thing he found, to be so thoroughly accepted after the duo of warriors introduced him as a priest of Azura. What was not heartwarming, though, was getting questioned by the wise women of the Erebenim Sun in case his teachers messed up their lessons. The old women probably just wanted someone to tease as they were away from their own children, he concluded. And he did so aloud, apparently, something which earned him the instant respect of the two brothers who patted his back and offered their condolences as they japped he would not survive the night. That was a jape, right? Potential ascension into the moon shadow aside, the day passed by without the young Mer even noticing it, and soon he found himself being dragged into the great hall where a roaring flame illuminated the gathered Ashlanders and a few other visitors, including an Argonian of all things. The 4 Ashkans of the great tribes took their seats at one shared table, and the rest followed suit. But they did not begin feasting immediately, as offerings would need to be made first. That gave Veyrin a moment to seek out the supposed hidden tribe he had heard about, and it did not take him long to find them. While the Ashkan of the Darhashin was not honored like the others, the ancient-looking elf did not seem to mind it one bit, smiling genially as he was surrounded by the smallest group in the gathering, a mere 24 Mer, something which would have been a heartwarming scene to behold if not for the Ashkan's visage. The old elf was a spindly thing, tall but unnaturally thin, and with holes in his cheeks which seemed to have scabbed over multiple times. His jaw looked somewhat elongated, and his teeth just a tad too long. He looked as if he had gotten every single skin disease in the history of Resdain. Skin disease. The words rung out in Veyrin's mind, but before he could come to any kind of conclusion, the hall hushed, and the wise women, one from each clan, came to the hall's center, placing humble offerings before the altars of the 4 corners of Troubled House to appease them through reluctant worship. The fact that the Ashlanders offered any kind of worship to Molag Bal, Mehrunes Dagoth, Malakath, and Sheogorath was still something Veyrin was not even close to accepting. For all his respect for the Ashlanders, that was yet a step too far in his eyes. Then came the offerings to the tribunal, or what he called the reclamations. Far more lavish and grand than the meager tribute paid to the gods of evil and wrongness, and with hymns of praise being sung with a surprising level of artistry involved. When the Urshilaku wise woman stepped before the altar to Azura, her movements ceased. She shivered and clutched at her body, almost as if trying to embrace herself, before she stilled once more, some artificial calming effect no doubt, and looked up. Veyrin's eyes widened as he felt his patron's presence within the old woman. and he soon found himself falling on his knees in prayer, something which drew immediate attention from the Ashlanders and quickly clued them in as to what was going on. Worthy worshippers, the woman spoke with words that were not hers. Hear of the coming of your salvation. Hear of he who shall show himself the chosen of your true gods, and who shall heal what was broken by those who are false. The wise woman's eyes met with Virin's, and he stilled. He shall come from foreign shores, and shall walk a sacred pilgrimage. His blade shall cut our foes, his words enlighten the unfaithful, and when his coming is over the web, he shall spin, will cover the land. A chance at redemption comes for all of our faithful, a chance for the bounteous paradise you have earned with your faith. The wise woman, Azura, whispered, "Hear now the name of your Redee." The priestess clutched at her forehead and fell on her knees, blood leaking from her eyes, ears, mouth, and nose. Virin was already by her side by the time she had fallen, his magic working its wonders to heal her as much as he was able. The other wise women gave him grateful looks, and the one in his hands blinked in surprise as she realized she was not thrown into unconsciousness. A commotion broke out, but was put down just as swiftly by the leaders of the clans, Wise Woman. The Ashkan of the Zainab spoke up. "What name were you given? Who has been so blessed by the gods to lead us all to salvation?" The wise woman's eyes widened as she heard something which no one else could. She looked down, no doubt contemplating something, before giving a quick, reverent nod and speaking with a noticeable wheeze in her voice, each word coming out with visible effort. "He who bears the blood of the irredeemable shall in turn be the only one capable of redeeming everyone else. Heed the words of Azura, and ready yourselves for the coming of Dagoth." Shouts of outrage and the noise of weapons being drawn in fury passed by Viran as so much light breeze. He was too focused on the divine revelation granted to them, and the purpose in life he had just been given. He would find this prophesied servant of the gods and help guide them to their destiny. Nothing else was acceptable.